This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. This kicks off our round of scrutiny of the Mayor's budget for this season, starting now, running through until the spring. Today's meeting is what I like to think of as our groupthink check. We have a series of outside experts on policing, on housing, and on transport to look at where we're going right, where we're going wrong, and what's going on in the world that we in the GLA are missing. But before we get to our main event this morning, we have a couple of bits of housekeeping. Firstly, can I ask everyone to make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid interruptions? And can I ask our clerk, Hannah Barlow, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies received.
OK. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Great, well noted. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of September 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? Confirmed. Brilliant. And finally, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed, closed and ongoing actions from its previous meetings? Noted. That's all very vague, isn't it? Whatever they may be. Right, now we move on to our main item this morning, which is a series of 3 panels with outside experts looking first at policing, then at housing, and then at transport. So I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests, which is Ian Wiggett, who is the Associate Director, World Policing Advisory. Good morning. And Professor Gloria Laycock, who's from the UCL Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science. Good morning. So if I kick off with the first question, so I'll start with you, Julia. Why is the Metropolitan Police Service under such financial strain despite receiving more money and having a shrinking workforce?
I think at the moment everywhere's under financial strain, and the Met isn't immune to it, sadly. The global situation is such, and the country's economy is such. And looking forward, it's not going to get better, it's worse. In fact, I was actually here last year and we seemed to have the same conversation then. It's not got better, it's got worse. The prospects are that it'll get even worse. And what I probably want to encourage the committee to do is think strategically on a long term, a much longer term than the next 12 months, about how the Met can be supported in facing this issue of financial stress.
So your view is that the sort of overall budget's likely to remain the same, so then we're in the world of how do you deliver the best policing service within that budget?
Well, if you've got, the budget seems to be getting, there is always a big black hole when it seems to me. So, but apart from the black hole issue, if what you've been doing is working and you've been, notwithstanding the reduced budget, if policing is going well in London, that might not be a problem. But I don't know whether it is, because despite being called the Budget and Performance Committee, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about performance. And there doesn't seem to be much data about crime or disorder or anything else in London. When I worked in the Home Office, which I did for 30 years, I had a budget, I had to say how I was spending it and whether it had worked or not. I'm a scientist, and in a sense, think of the Met's job as an experiment, and they're doing it the way they're doing it. Can they do it in a different way, given the budgetary constraints? And there's a lot of evidence about what works these days. Do we know whether the Met are taking full advantage of that evidence or not?
Thank you very much. Actually, we did discuss this, I think, 2 years ago when we had the first one of these panels. And one of the challenges put to us by our external experts panel then was the difficulty in defining precisely what are the outputs for policing. So with transport, it's how many people do you move, how quickly do you move them. With housing, you can look at how many houses are built. With policing, it's not quite clear what are the outputs that you're trying to measure. So I don't know whether you have a thought on that.
I wouldn't be measuring outputs. I'd want to know about outcomes. And it's outputs, like how many bobbies have we got pounding the beat or something. The outcomes is what's the effect on crime. So first of all, what are the base rates for crime in London? Over a long period, are they getting better or worse? Are new crimes developing? And I can tell you they are, clearly. Cybercrime, computer-related fraud, are going through the roof. Are the Met well placed to deal with that? Have they got the right training? Have they got the right people in place? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian?
Yeah, just building on that point, I think outputs can be counterproductive. They can be informative, but counterproductive. So if you want to know the number of arrests, for example, that isn't necessarily a positive. Increasing the number of arrests isn't necessarily a good outcome. And in some types of crimes, we want to encourage people to report crimes. So that outputs is a difficult bit. If we can focus on outcomes, be far better. But coming back to your original point, the police budget in England and Wales is still, in real terms, below 2010 levels. So it dipped considerably, it recovered, but it's still behind where it was in 2010. The Met, the way that budget has then been allocated between forces has not been favourable to the Met either. So forces that have got the potential to are more reliant on the police precept have been able to come through that the last 15 years relatively unscathed. Other forces have been worse affected than the Met and are still below in budget levels and police officer strengths where they were in 2010. So over the last 15 years, forces have gone on a different direction. For the Met, the Capital Cities grant hasn't kept pace. The precept has been increasing, but it's still not producing the level of income that other forces have. The funding formula, everybody says it's not fit for purpose, but the Home Office has been sitting on the review of that, and it's not been published yet, and it's still, that was due to be published about 3 years ago. And out of that, there's no guarantee that the Met will be a winner. They might be a loser from that. I think what I'd sort of start pointing to really is if you run an organisation where you set your level of costs at a certain level that is always above the actual income and budget that you get, then at some stage you're going to have to sort of make a decision, and this is for the Mayor, MOPAC and the Met to decide, at what stage do we have to say that's the budget we've got and we have to come up with a policing model that works within that funding envelope? Or do we keep saying that we need 200 million more, whatever it is, and that's the gap, but that never arises? So each year you're having to, the MOPAC and the Met is having to find emergency savings elsewhere, and each year things happen, like protests, major events, and somehow the money is found for that, but then the finance department has to come up and balance the books. And the Met keeps operating on that situation from what I can see, and it can't seem to get itself out of this hole. So I note from the some of the information before that the Met has got the lowest proportion of police staff of the police forces in England and Wales. It's about 75% police officers. So what we've seen is the officerisation of the workforce. If you want to match national average, which is about 1/3, 2/3, there's two ways of doing that: either to grow the number of police staff, which is impossible because the money's not there, or to reduce the number of police officers to a level that would match the police staff level. But what you end up with is, yes, you've got more police officers, but what are they doing? They're answering phones, they're in offices, they're doing inquiries that could be done by other people. So if you're looking at outcomes, yes, we've grown the number of police officers, but the outcome is that actually their effect on the streets and their effect in policing terms is less than you would hope it to be.
Thanks, that's a very good point. So obviously the Commissioner talks about tough choices, and from what you're saying, maybe there are more of those on the horizon, or possibly what you're suggesting is like a major rethink to reset the level of expected resource incoming and effectively, cut the cloth
I think it's slightly more complicated than that, because your statement implies they'll carry on as they have been doing in terms of what they do. not how many of them are doing it. And I think if the Commissioner were to have a reset, as you call it, he might want to think about how the police are policing and whether there's a better way of doing it. I mean, obviously, come clean, I've got a vested interest in problem solving, which means that basically it's the answer to all crime is not necessarily to arrest people. If you want crime to go down, you have to think rather differently. And the reason car crime, I might have mentioned this before, but the reason car crime, to take an example, has dropped by well over 80% in the last 40 years is because the car manufacturers put a lock and an immobiliser on the cars. And that was nothing to do with policing. So it's thinking with an open mind when you see a crime problem as to how it might be solved. And coming from a crime science faculty, my advice would be to think more experimentally, test things, and that would really mean that you would have to back the Commissioner because some experiments fail. But that's how you learn. That's how engineers have got planes that don't fall out of the sky. It's about learning, and that means risk-taking. So if you were going to seriously think about how policing operates in London, you've got to take more risks, do more experiments, and see crime as a problem to be solved, not just simply something that the response is always, let's try and arrest more people. And that's why arrests are a very poor measure, actually. I mean, I remember, I won't name him, but one commissioner telling me that if their performance measure were arrests, they'd go out and arrest every drug dealer and every minuscule person doing heaven knows what and push their arrest rate right up. But that's not really the point.
So just on those experiments, do you have, I'm just a bit conscious of time and I need to hand over to the rest of the committee, but do you have some examples of experiments that you think should be run or could be run that aren't?
Well, just to give you, I'm sorry, a very quick example. A few weeks ago, I was at the United Kingdom Problem-Oriented Policing Awards. Last year, there was one Met officer. There were 30 forces represented. Last year, 32 forces represented, and one Met officer. This year, there were 40 forces represented, and 2 of the 5 finalists were from the Met. And the Met presence was much higher. And what they'd done was they'd found a problem. The one in particular, which I thought was really excellent, was looking at shop theft. And they'd analysed the data and they'd focused on the problem and they'd worked importantly with the local tradespeople, the co-op. In fact, there were 2 people from the co-op at the conference. Unfortunately, I mean, we were all excited. The Met did really, really well, and we were hoping to get some publicity. And the last day of the conference, when they were going to come back to the Met to tell everybody, there was a panorama programme. And that just floored them. All that good work that they'd done was not going to be noticed within the Met, never mind anywhere else, because the agenda had been wiped out by Charing Cross Police Station.
Yeah, it's a good example of the problem of how bad police create such a problem for everyone else.
If I could just come back one more moment, a lot of the good problem solving is done at neighbourhood level. It could be done in all across the police, you know, in the traffic department, anywhere. A lot of it is done in neighbourhood level. And I noticed the commissioners reinforcing neighbourhood policing, but count abstractions. All of the projects that were presented at that conference, a senior officer had to stand up and say, and this was across the UK, I had to protect those neighbourhood police from abstractions, because otherwise their projects would never have been done.
Yeah, we hear that again and again from my local police, that they get abstracted for protests and things, and it just
I
cuts
mean,
them
I'm
off at the knees.
I think it speaks to the Commissioner needing more money for protests and that kind of thing, so he can protect neighbourhood police. But even if you just know that the neighbourhood police are doing a project and it's important they finish it, so we'll protect that little pocket and that little pocket of neighbourhood policing and abstract from somewhere else, sadly. And some of the forces said, well, I had to protect them because they were doing this super project, so I took my abstractions disproportionately from another area.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. we've been talking a lot about the police and their budget and how they could do things differently and what have you. Do you have any views on how MOPAC themselves could do things differently? Because obviously that's also a major drain on resources.
I mean, I'm not sure it's a major drain, but I
it's
know
still a
what
cost.
you mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Quite. And I don't know enough about what MOPAC do to answer that question fairly, but I do notice they're responsible for the violence reduction unit. Mm-hmm. And I would encourage them to have a look at the extent to which they're effective, the violence reduction units. The data isn't really supporting of it. I mean, going back to my previous point, they're an experiment and they're allowed to fail, but they're also allowed to be improved, and that's one of the reasons that you do experiments. You want to see continuous improvement. I think it probably is worth looking at what MOPAC do in a little bit more detail, but I'm very conscious that it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the funding of the Metropolitan Police.
Thank you.
I suppose I should declare that I did some contract work where I was technically employed by MOPAC probably a couple of years ago now, although it wasn't work in London for MOPAC. They were just the contractor on behalf of the Home Office. So I have got some insight, I suppose. I think on what I would say is MOPAC is considerably larger than most police and crime commissioner offices around the country. Yes, the Met is larger, so you'd expect it, but I think that might be an area to look at is the proportion of it. The governance arrangement is slightly unique here as well, so you're holding the Mayor to account, as I understand it, and the Mayor runs it through the office, and the Commissioner's got operational independence. That's, again, a slightly different arrangement to what you might get in other forces where the Police and Crime Commissioner's office is very closely aligned and rely, in fact, on the force for much of their information. I think what I can see is that sometimes there's difficulty between MOPAC and the Met getting and sharing information. The information would be asked for and then it'll take some time to come back. There isn't that comfortable relationship that you would get in a county constabulary where the Commissioner's office is in the same building as the Chief Constable's office and somebody can walk down the corridor and have a chat. And so I think that's the sort of arrangement that there is. And obviously so much more is under the political spotlight here and the media attention. I think there is an awful lot of good work going on in MOPAC, but I think they then share some of those frustrations about getting that traction in the force as well. And maybe that could be eased if the relationship was more direct and could be managed differently. But where are the barriers in that relationship? And everybody will have their view on how that relationship works and why it's better and not so good in others. But I think that would be an area to look at.
Okay. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Georgiou.
Professor Laycock, very sorry, Assembly Member Mahfouz, I'm sure his works. With regard to your point about experimentation, I think one of my frustrations has always been that politicians try to coalition build by wasting money on particular projects, thinking, well, this will buy me votes here and there. And we've seen it throughout the Met's history. You know, this is not unique to this Mayor of London. We've seen it plenty of times. But I guess my question to you is there an argument to say that, you know, essentially political involvement on budgetary experimental spends should be removed, and any mayor, any senior politician, even in the Home Office, should effectively allow the professionals to say, look, we are going to experiment with this. This isn't a pet political project. This is evidence-based, and this is the way we should proceed. Because people think, oh, you know, £100,000 for experimental dancing to stop knife crime is going to solve the problem. You know, 100,000 here, 100,000 there. It all adds up. I mean, what's your view on that?
I kind of couldn't agree with you more. I was head of police research in the Home Office where we did experiments. this was a very long time ago, I must say. I'm talking 30 years ago or something. And at that time, I was in the police department doing experiments, and the politicians were very keen to say, oh, that's a pilot study, right? And they wouldn't wait for the results before they either mainstreamed it or rubbished it. And so I was perpetually defending. I mean, occasionally something absolutely significant would be discovered. I mean, one of the best projects we ever managed was a project that reduced domestic burglary on an absolutely horrendous housing estate by concentrating on protecting repeat victims. And I said to a particular minister, repeat victimisation is an amazingly great focus for crime prevention. It happens in domestic violence, it happens in domestic burglary, it happened in car crime, it happened in almost everything we looked at. Racial attacks, repeat victims all the time. Can we make this a policy kind of platform? And he said, repeat victimisation's got too many syllables in it. Can you think of something snappier? And to my shame, I couldn't. But to his credit, he said, carry on doing the work, it's just not very politically interesting. And that's exactly the problem you're kind of describing. And you're aware of it, and how you handle that, how you protect experimental work from the understandable wish of politicians to be re-elected by their constituents. I'm not sure, but I do think that's one of those problems that needs to be addressed.
The governance arrangements for policing at the moment are confusing, I suppose. So you have the Home Office with the Home Secretary that will want to push forward a particular political agenda and show that they're having an influence and making a difference to policing and the safety and security across the country. But forces are in effect under the control, perhaps the wrong word, but the political accountability sits with the Police and Crime Commissioner or the Mayor, and then the operational independence sits with the Chief Constable. So between that, multiply that by 43 times across the country, you've got a complete mishmash of systems, styles of policing, decisions that go on. If you look at schemes like the Violence Reduction Programme and the County Lines Programme, they will point to successes. And then, as we've discussed earlier, why isn't that success being replicated across the country? Well, that's down to individual chief constables and individual police and crime commissioners as to whether, and mayors as to whether or not they're going to fund them or whether that supports their programme. So what you see, for example, now is the neighbourhood policing programme, where money is taken out of the national programme because the Home Secretary wants more neighbourhood police on the ground. Admirable. But that's coming out of the policing pot. So that's money that otherwise the Commissioner and the Mayor would be receiving to be able to spend in the ways that they see fit for London. And it may well be that they want more neighbourhood police, but they're having to fill in various boxes for the Home Office in order to deliver that. So that political accountability and where decisions are made gets very confusing. I can see, understandably, why a minister in Whitehall would want to show that they're having some effect. The bit that seems to be missing, I think, from a lot of these programmes is evaluation at the end of it. You know, it's what matters is the political announcement. Very few people stick around and bother to read the evaluation, if indeed the evaluation is done.
Thanks. Assembly-member Hall.
Thank you. If I could just go back very, very briefly to something you said, Professor. You said this is a budget and performance committee, and there's not much performance to assure you. On one level, the Police and Crime Committee itself does look into performance. But then, of course, we have to look at what we're told. And you only have to look at what we've been told about rape gangs and them not being there. So you take that as something that must be true, only to be found out 6 months, 9 months later that actually what you were told was not true at all. So we do have issues with what we're being told at times. But I'll go back onto the budget as we're concentrating on the budget. It's very disappointing, though. The Met Commissioner spoke last week at the Police and Crime Committee on why the Met is running out of money despite rising funding and sadly a shrinking workforce. He mentioned how the Met had relied on funding from reserves and property sales, but of course these opportunities are gone now because they're one-offs. Any of us, that have done business know that that's clearly the way. Last year, we made them deliver a balanced budget, which they hadn't done for many years, which is a positive thing. But how helpful is it that the Mayor consistently publishes plans for future years for the Met that he knows are unaffordable? If we keep putting things in a budget that are unaffordable, that's going to lead to tough choices. And if you're a housewife, you've got so much in your purse, that's what you can spend. It's no good looking at new three-piece suite and then being disappointed because you can't buy it because you haven't got enough money in your purse. So isn't it really important that the Mayor only publishes budgets that he knows is affordable? Whichever of you want to go first.
It would be nice if he did do that. I think there's an argument to be made to keep the pressure up on the Met to deliver, to be aspirational, if you like. Yes, you've got the fixed budget you've got, but can you do more with it? But I do take your point. It comes back to the political issue, I suppose, and all politicians do the same. They want to look good in the eyes of their constituents. So I think I would come back to the data. I mean, the budget's one side of the data, but the crime and disorder problems that the Met are facing are the other side. And, I mean, who knows, maybe the Commissioner can come up with some amazing plan to deliver the kind of outcomes that the Mayor's asking for within the budget. But that's the challenge. Can I just come back to the question that I was asked earlier about, is there a problem that I think the Met could be dealing with differently? And there is, and I think that problem is the culture in the Met, the thing that led to the appalling Panorama programme. And what problem solving as a process does, it first of all wants to understand the problem. So my first question is just exactly how many police stations in the Met are in that horrible Charing Cross category? Is it just a one-off, or is it a common underlying problem? And the next question is, can you work out how many and what kind of things might you do to stop it? And that's about, it's not just about exposing those difficult officers, because all that did in Charing Cross was push it underground. That's what clearly came across from that programme.
Yeah.
So I'd want to say to the Commissioner, how about taking a problem-solving approach to this? How much of it is there? Where is it worse? Where are the problems? Do some experiments to do things differently. It's not just about detection and exposing the bad.
I have to speak up. In fairness, they are doing lots to see if they can address the problems. I know the Commissioner is going, because I asked him, it's one of the questions I asked, I know he's going to government to see if he can have extra money in order to set forth various different ways of looking at this, because at the moment they just haven't got the money within the budget to put extra funding into looking at culture issues. But it's not to say that they're not, they are. It is a massive problem. When you look at the size of the workforce, it is a problem. And the other point that he would make if he was here is that obviously the police force reflect the people around them that are recruited in. And, you know, none of us are perfect. And this is one of the problems they've got. I mean, it's far too long a conversation for us to have in a budget
It's a very
meeting.
interesting conversation.
But on behalf of the police, I do know they are trying. They're really trying. But we ought to go back to budget. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble with
could
my
I sort of just?
here.
I don't want to.
No, all I wanted to say was I don't think it's necessarily a matter of more money. It's a matter of doing something differently. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's the point I made, I think, about if we go back to the budget side of things, is the inability to set a 3-year budget plan and plan that far ahead with confidence about the expenditure and the income over that period is a problem for all forces. It's unusual to know 3 years down the line exactly what you're going to get and what the spend will be, but it seems to be a particular issue here. And if you constantly set an expectation, an ambition, particularly around the number of police officers, that seems to be where we're stuck at the moment, is that the measure of policing is how many cops you've got. And that's great, but actually it should be about the outcomes that are being produced by the amount of money that is being put into policing. And if you start thinking about that, you can probably get you come up with different models, and we've been through those phases. There's pros and cons to all of those. I think there's a particular problem with the Met is that the operational side keeps blowing it off course. So protests in particular and policing itself is very much focused on the immediate operational challenge. So if there's a crisis now, forget about cost and budget, go out and deal with it, and we'll worry about the budget afterwards. And if that keeps happening, you end up 6 months into the year and we've got a budget problem.
The trouble is, it's so complex. And of course, when you've got all these protests, you do need boots on the streets, to be fair. I mean, it's so easy for us to point fingers at different things. It's such a complex issue. And I'm sure the Commissioner would say that if he was sitting here. It is very complex. And if you're explaining to the public, you know, what do we work out there, you know, how good they are or bad they are, it is so complex. That's why I think it goes down to how many police officers have you got, because what gives people reassurance is seeing police officers walking up and down the street. It's too simplistic, and those of you that understand it, of course it's far too simplistic, but if you're selling it to the public, and to go back on your point, politicians don't always want to just look good to the public, they actually want to achieve in the eyes of the public, and that's what hopefully most of us do. I know that's why I'm in politics, but if we go back to the budget, or I'll be in trouble again. So if I can ask you, what are the main drivers of the Met's recruitment and retention challenges, and how does London's recruitment position compare with other police services? Shall I start with you, Ian, this time?
The Met has had a particular challenge for a long time, actually. It's not been, it's never gone away. Living in London is expensive, it's attractive, but it's expensive, and the salary levels are higher. London Weighting obviously applies, but it doesn't compensate for the costs of living here. So the potential to attract people is more limited. And there's also a regular flow of people out of the Met into other forces, so they come and get trained and then they leave. Retention seems to be a big problem across the country. So I recently looked at the figures, and nationally around 25% of those who are recruited will leave within the first 2 years. So there's a huge churn of the costs of recruitment, vetting, training that goes into that. They turn up, they'll start picking up work, learning. And most of the officers on the street that the public want to see are going to be brand new recruits. They'll be in their first months, years of service, and they're not going to hang around. You know, most of them are not going to hang around. They're going to go. So that is a real challenge, and it's a challenge nationally, but it's particularly for the Met. And the amount of effort the Met is having to put into this is absorbing a huge amount of resource and time, because they need to be mentored, they need to be trained on the street. Somebody will have to show them how to log onto a computer, how to investigate cases, and that's just a constant drain on supervision as well.
I agree with that, but the only thing is, if you look at specifics like firearm officers, now when I've talked to police and crime commissioners elsewhere, they say that the metropolitan firearms officers do not feel supported. If you look at the Chris Carver case, which was a damn disgrace, so many of them gave their tickets in and then wanted to move out. And then when we need additional firearms officers in the Met from outside, many of them don't want to come in because they don't feel that should they have to make that dreadful, half a second choice, they won't be backed up.
That's a really difficult, that's a really difficult issue, very complex issue. There is a real sense, I think, I detect in the front line, and it's not limited to the Met, it's national, but it seems to be particularly amplified here, I think, about the morale and the confidence in leadership, in the political guidance that they're going to be supported and guided. If they're called upon to make difficult decisions, really difficult, you're putting people into the most difficult positions. And it's not just that firearm officer, it's also everybody involved in the chain of decision-making in that operation that, and I've been there myself. I'm the one that authorises the deployment and those operations, and I know that I'm sending somebody in that might have, and it's me that's then accountable for those decisions. And I think we've been on a long journey where that's become increasingly unattractive and risky professionally. But there is, yes, I think, and it, to some extent, it's also linked to the Charing Cross situation where there is a disconnect between where the front line are and the sort of problems that they see and the things that they have to deal with on a daily basis, and then what they're hearing from their management and comfortable management, from their leaders. Is it an accepted measure? Is it a comfortable measure? We're talking about culture change. But also, I think, you're quite right to pick up on that issue of do they feel supported, and is it an attractive place to work, and is it an attractive job to take on? There's lots of those. It's not just the firearms officers' role.
No, I picked on that because the Chris Carver case was just so dire. Despite the fact I've got dozens more questions, I'd better hand it back to you, Chair, because we're running short, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to turn to Professor Laycock for the first question I have, which is just on the Mayor's new police and crime plan. Do you feel it's realistic, given the financial pressures that the Met is under and also the workforce issues?
I'm sorry if it sounds repetitious, but I thought the police and crime plan, like almost all of these things, was, grand. Yeah, super. Of course you want more of this and less of that and so on. But there was no sense of how it was going to be achieved within that budget. And that's what I think I meant by mentioning performance. I did mean to say I appreciate there's lots going on elsewhere that I'm not aware of. But I suppose you have to have aspirations, and I think that most of those plans I've read about from the Met have been hugely aspirational. And setting aside the budget, I'd just like to know how they're going to be achieved. And just sorry to come back to Charing Cross, but that's an example of a massive failure not delivering some aspect of that police and crime plan. And so my challenge would be, what are you going to do? What are you actually going to do to deliver those wonderfully aspirational plans within the budget? And it can't be more of what you've been doing, because what you've been doing, for example, led to Charing Cross. And I do get the point, it's complicated. But a long-term strategic plan for the development of policing, we can always do better. I mean, policing evolves, and there's no sense of the way in which it's evolving. It's just, we're going to deliver this and we're going to deliver that. How are you going to do that?
I think it's inevitable in the way the governance arrangements are set in law. You're in effect the police and crime panel, so you are there to hold the police authority, the commissioner, not the commissioner, the mayor, or the police and crime commissioner, if you were a county, to account for their job. Their job is to set the budget and give the policing priorities to the Commissioner, the Chief Constable, and it's the Commissioner who's responsible for delivering that operationally. So you're one step, two step removed from the operational delivery on the ground. The questions, I think, are the valid ones that we've had before. Is that budget realistic? Are there realistic plans to set behind the ambitions? Or are we just going to find ourselves in a year's time in the same place with the same issues? And are the big decisions, are the big challenges being taken on? I think that's where the questions are for you.
Okay. And just Ian, on the new Met for London Phase 2 plan and the principle that creators of cost, for instance, policing of major events such as football, Premier League matches, etc., should pay the bill. To what extent should this relieve financial pressure on the Met if it can be recouped?
Some of those are big costs. So football policing, the football clubs are making large amounts of money, and the public purse is picking up an awful lot of costs associated with those major events, concerts, things like that. They're great, but there's a cost for the public purse in supporting them and managing them and running them safely, and those costs are not being met. Right care, right place is another one. Where the mental health, mental illness and mental crisis is often being passed to police when it should be ideally picked up by somewhere in the health service. But in effect, we're shuffling, with some of those, we're just shuffling the costs around. So if the police don't deal with it and it goes to the health service, well, who in the health service is picked up with it? And maybe they're not funded to deal with it either. And then I think there's a bigger question that you see other places. I mean, I worked in Manchester for some time, and I think you see there the ambition, and you certainly get that in London, the ambition of making London better, a thriving world city. And part of that is having big major events and having lots. It brings in a huge amount of money to the economy, and policing is part of that economy of London. So if you start sort of pulling the plug on some of these things, then that's going to have a cost as well. So there is a balance there to be found. But I think at the moment the Met is obviously in a difficult situation and trying to find, it's turning all the cushions. It's not the three-piece suite. It's turning the sofa upside down to see if there's any small change still hidden down the back. And they're reaching out for things like that. There are obvious big drains that wouldn't it be great if your neighbourhood officer could stay in your boroughs on the weekend rather than have to spend their time traipsing up to whichever football ground it is or whichever event it is that they're policing this weekend, and they're not there to police their local population.
Can I just say on that, I have no problem with cross-charging the football clubs. They've got millions to spend on players. I mean, maybe I'm being grossly unfair. I don't care about football. Actually, I'm a Liverpool fan, but that's not the point. They've got lots of money to pay players. They can jolly well pay for their policing, and they can take the issue of disorder more seriously. While they can offload the problem onto the police largely, although I appreciate they do pay something at the moment, I'd explore the possibility of full charging.
Thank you. And just on lessons that London might be able to draw from other police services, and particularly, technologies evolving all the time. There's new technology available as well, such as drones, AI, command and control systems. Do you have any examples of how other police forces are using them, if not in the UK or around the world? And how should these be assessed? And I appreciate, Professor Laycock, you've already sort of mentioned the experimental approach, but how should the cost and benefits of investing in these be evaluated?
I think you need to look at, the issue is looking at what is the problem that we're trying to solve here. So there are one issue that I can think of, one problem I can think of, you're talking about the closure of front desks. There are various options around the world that are available now where why do you need to go into a physical front counter? But what people need is a face-to-face contact. So it's not so much going online to do things, but actually I want to have a face-to-face contact with somebody and speak, we can do a video call. And there are forces that offer that. They're smart police stations. You go into a box, a bit like one of those old bank cash point front counters. It's secure, it's lit, and you can have you can do your transaction face to face with somebody in there and speak to an expert. Those offer services, but there's a cost in investing in those, and at the moment there isn't the cash in the budget to do that. A drone response is great. You can have fixed boxes set on the roofs of buildings. You can press a button, the drone can go up and it'll fly directly to where the incident is happening, and you can get a direct view of what's happening, and that can save deployment or make sure that the right deployment gets there sooner, and can lots of benefits from those things, but again that requires cost of investment to do that. There's all sorts of AI options coming into place that will save time in paperwork, or claim to save time in paperwork, or speed up decision making so that you can spot and detect crimes more quickly. But again, there's a cost to buying those systems, and at the end of the day somebody's still got to go out and arrest somebody or respond to an incident, and you can somehow create a demand that actually can't then be satisfied. But there's a few areas, and I think the thing with the Met is somebody in the Met somewhere will be looking at these things and will be testing them, but to scale them up across London requires a lot of money and some big decision making, and that's where it suddenly starts to get quite difficult. But certainly, like with firearms operations, the use of drones there and things can make a lot of difference and save. If you think of the cost of that inquiry in W80 case and all the torment and for all involved in that went through it, potentially some of that could be saved through different technologies. Those options are out there.
Sorry, off the top of my head, I think there are 4 ways in which technology is relevant to crime control. The first is that some of the new technologies can cause crime. It can be massively criminogenic, and the police need to be looking forward at what's coming. Bitcoin's a good example, probably. It can help in solving crimes, and drones spring to mind. But I would be very careful how they were introduced. If they were seen as a super surveillance opportunity, it puts CCTV in the shade. The potential of having drones over our cities, regardless, is a bit scary. It can help in preventing crime, though, with good design and so on. And I think, importantly, it can help with management costs. And we've mentioned AI, a possibility. The good thing about having a really rubbish system that the Met seems to have at the moment is that you could replace it lock, stock and barrel, but it would cost a lot. And I'd be inclined to say to the government, how about a one-off payment for us to totally revolutionise the technology in the Met? It'll cost a gazillion or whatever it will cost. But if you had a good plan, and this is what I mean by forward thinking, this is what I mean by strategic planning, all these technologies are available in the private sector, but they're almost invisible in the public sector, apart from in aspirational terms. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we had this, that, and whatever? AI is moving at such a rate that there really is a case for having a massive investment, and there's probably a cost-benefit case to be made in relation to adopting new technologies in the police generally, but in the Met in particular.
Thanks. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. Professor Laycock, can I just explore that idea with you? You said having drones over the city feels scary. Could I ask, what is it about drones over the city that's scary?
Well, first of all, they make a noise, apparently. And it's just in-your-face surveillance. I mean, I know where CCTV cameras are. I welcome them, largely speaking. They're in high-risk places. Drones aren't quite so discriminatory. And I can imagine a situation in which a chronically right-wing government took over the United Kingdom and made copious use of drones, and I personally, as a citizen, wouldn't like it. So I do think we have to be very careful about some of the use of these new technologies. I remember having a student who was an engineer being interviewed for a PhD, and I said, did he think there were any sort of social implications about drones? And he said, oh, no, none whatsoever. And I was thinking of a chronic housing estate with drones going on patrol all the time. And the public might have a view about that.
Thank you. The reason why I'm asking this, because this is Budget Committee, is you talked also about there being a cost-benefit case. So I think the moral and ethical kind of fears,
well,
I think...
indeed. I mean, that would come into the equation, the ethics of it. But I wasn't thinking specifically about drones then. I was thinking about technology very broadly, and including the sort of improvement in management technologies that you've got. Just in terms of how the public feel about the police and what you can do to improve their image and so on, all that sort of thing. It's communication. There are massive opportunities in terms of communicating between the police and the public, rather better than we maybe have a track record of doing.
And does it slightly come back to your culture point? Because Assemblymember Hall made the point before, I think she said, speaking on behalf of the police, etc., etc. But I'd present, probably unsurprisingly, the reverse argument that if we've got a Casey review that says, you know, we've got an institutionally misogynistic and racist Met Police, but then we have a commissioner who says that we don't or won't accept that, you can put all the money in the world. There's a culture issue there.
Some years ago, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he funded an American academic to look at the culture in the health service. And one of his... when I talk about outcomes, I'm talking about behaviour. And it's the behaviour that we object to. And that's, to some extent, a function of the culture. What was concluded by this academic was that culture trumps rules and regulations and training every time. And it's how you manage and change culture that's hugely important. And just coming back to a statement made earlier about recruits, some of those police recruits, evidence shows, join the police service for the best possible reasons. And then the reality of it leads to them resigning within a couple of years. And that's, to some extent, a function of the culture. So I do think it's incredibly important that some revolutionary, innovative thought is given to changing and improving the culture.
Right, so that's put really well. And finally, just to come back to technology, so the SANCATs, for instance, as far as I understand it, the police haven't given acceptable, they're not answering the questions around a business case, never mind the safeguarding case. What impact do you think that has on Londoners to know that there's neither been a cost business case or a safeguarding case for new technology?
Well, I'm not sure how many Londoners think about it, to be honest, but I think it's an opportunity to think about the possibilities of new technology, but bearing in mind all the time that technologies can be abused. And that's why I think a balanced view of the whole thing is really necessary. I mean, the reason I'm really quite keen on all of this is at the Jill Dando Institute, we've got a Dawes Centre for Future Crime, and it's specifically looking at the new technologies coming out of the engineer. The Jill Dando Institute is in the engineering faculty. It's not in law or social science, it's in engineering. And the engineers are developing things all the time without any thought about the crime implications, either positive or negative as it happens. But there's huge potential on the positive side with these new upcoming technologies to develop them. As I said earlier, there's a huge cost to implementing them. And implementation is often a much underrated problem, actually, in my experience.
I'm sorry, can I just add one more thing to tie the conversation together? That if we're not getting the culture right, or if the culture isn't as good as, you know, I think it's an understatement, as good as it could be, and we're creating new technology, but that's not being communicated to the public, I agree that the public aren't thinking about the new technology necessarily every day, but they are thinking about trust in police, and that's already quite low, and I think this just adds to that culture, doesn't it?
I mean, I don't think I think the public quite like technology. What do I know? I don't have the evidence about what
Sure.
the public think about technology or the extent to which they think about it. But most of the comments in the media about the police are negative. This was my point earlier, that there were two fabulous projects at the problem-solving conference, and nobody in the Met mentioned them, never mind the public. And it's always been the case. And so the public are not, the media dominate the public view of crime and policing in many ways and don't report on the good bits. Now, there are some technological innovations that the media might quite like, actually. Oh, you know what? They've got this wonderful AI thing that does something or other. And young people in particular. I mean, my generation, I might be thinking technology. I don't know which button to push. But young people are so familiar with technologies. I mean, my grandchild has to help me turn the computer on a bad day. But young people are not like me. They are totally cool about it and do it all the time. And it would be, I suspect many of them would be a little bit horrified if they had a look at the systems that the police use. That's why I think it's an opportunity for a major investment, particularly in the Met.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Ian, I think you wanted to come.
Yes, sorry, I was just going to say, I think trust and confidence is at the root of it. People are quite happy to give up vast amounts of personal data in order to access free Wi-Fi or get onto a certain website or whatever it is, and don't think about the personal data control and all that sits with it. One view of facial recognition is that if you've got nothing to fear and you've got nothing to hide, then it's not a problem. But having drones flying around or cameras poking in your face, you walk into shopping malls and you're under video surveillance all the time, and it's there for your safety, and people are quite happy to accept it. But when it seems to be with a police badge on it, people start getting worried about state surveillance and intrusions onto privacy. So something really is to figure out is how do we, but the world is changing and technology is moving on. So if that's the future, how do we manage that in a way that takes the public with you? What safeguards are there on that? And how can the police demonstrate that it's being run properly and isn't being abused and there's general benefit? And at the moment, I think that's the bit that people are thinking about. It's there, but it's the attention is going on the glitzy new technology and less about what are the ramifications that go with that and how do we protect that?
Would you say transparency is key without leading you too much?
Well, having worked in the world of intelligence and undercover operations and organised crime, I'm very wary about how transparent transparency is. You've got to have confidence that the systems are in place and are being followed. It's not necessarily about making it completely transparent. It's that there's transparency about the systems that are in place to manage the security and governance of how that's used.
I'll take transparency systems. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we're in danger now of cutting into our other 2 seconds. I think it's right we spend a bit more time on policing. It's an important topic, but got 2 bits left and 2 minutes really until we need to be winding up, so we can cut a bit into the next sections, but we can try and be brief in our questions and answers. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. This was going to be a question about the spending review and the 25-26 funding settlement, but of course we know that even with those additional monies, there's still a £260 million black hole in the budget. So just to change it slightly, the next thing which is coming down the line is the Fair Funding Review 2.0, and do you have any views about how that might have an impact on policing in London and the availability of funds from government?
Well, I was going to say, if you're not aware, I don't think there's many people that actually really know what's coming out of it, other than public funding, and the budget settlement is likely to be very tight. The Home Office itself is focused on immigration, so more and more of the effort and the resources that go with it are going into the immigration side. The criminal justice system needs an awful lot of money spent on it as well. So I'm not sure there's a huge amount left for policing. I can see that there's going to be more. I would be fairly confident that more will be placed onto the local taxes, onto the council tax, and expectations that council tax will rise by the maximum. But if one force area starts at a certain level and another one is starting at a certain level, each increase sees areas falling behind. I think the whole of police funding needs to be looked at. The funding formula, the council tax arrangements, where the central budgets are going. About 11% of the budget goes to national projects, which are years behind and massively overspent. And I can't see any particular light at the end of the tunnel for those projects either. So at some stage, I'd be asking, do we really want to carry on with those things, or are there other alternatives that can save money and protect local policing? But that's a personal view, and I'm sure the project leads would have a different update on it.
Very briefly, I want to encourage the Home Office to stop top slicing the police budget for their own pet projects. No problem with pet projects, but find the money from somewhere else, not the police budget.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Somebody in the hall.
Right, I've got to speed through these. The Police Superintendents Association highlights woeful, inadequate IT infrastructure and outdated buildings, and you touched on that. But I have to say there is millions going into various IT projects at the moment. I think the problem is, with the greatest respect, the amount of money paid to so-called experts coming in is getting nowhere and costing a fortune. So there's not enough time to explore that. But I must say I'm a massive supporter of drones. Now, whether that says where I am on the political spectrum or not, I'm not sure. But there's some incredible work going on there. And if you look at the estate strategy, apparently it's coming out soon. We're not holding our breath, no. But because £42 million has been put aside to look into carbonising or whatever these outdated buildings, but that might come down now because God knows how many police buildings we're going to lose. So we've covered some of that. The last part is, of course, the NIC grant, or the National and International Capital City grant. Despite the fact that the government, to be fair, have put extra money in, which, you know, certainly needs it, we're still at least £180 million short on that account. Do you think, just a yes or no, really, that the Mayor should dip into his considerable £21 billion budget and put more into policing, if only to cover that, because these demonstrations are costing all of us a fortune? Just a quick, or I'll be in trouble.
Yes. The thing is what then is losing out from as a result of that, and that's, I don't know if he puts it into policing. Yes, I'm all for that.
Well, you could take it out the net zero billions that are going. So well, there's an idea.
That's where you stray into territory that I probably shouldn't comment on. But that's the political choice for the Mayor to make, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and he does. I'd rather it went into policing, but there we go. Do you want to?
No, I agree with what Ian's just said.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't see any other indication, so that concludes our first panel this morning on policing. Although, before we wrap up, slightly inopportune timing, can I welcome to the public gallery Year 5 students from Manor Park Primary School in Barking and Dagenham. Hello, you've arrived just in time for me to announce a short 5-minute break while we change from our first panel on policing to our second panel, which will be looking at housing. So we will return at 11:09 by my watch. Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome back to the second panel in our Budget and Performance Committee this morning, where we are looking at housing. We have a panel of outside experts comprising Antonia Jennings, who is the CEO for the Centre for London. We have Luke Hillam, who's the Strategic Finance Analyst from London Councils. We have Jonathan Seeger, who's the Director of Place Business London. And also joining us imminently, although not quite here yet, is Professor Adrian Pabst, who's the Deputy Director, Social and Political Economy at the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. So we have about an hour for this panel, and then we'll have another short adjournment while we change for transport. So if I kick off with a broad question, so we'll be looking at the affordable housing programme shortly, but thinking about the context in which that's happening as the wider London housing market, what's your assessment of how that's going? And in particular, perhaps we know that it's not going well, but in particular, what are the sort of new emerging or changing factors in London's housing market? Antonia, would you like to kick off? There's a little button with a person with some little sound coming out of their mouth. Perfect.
Great. Does that work?
Yes.
Fab. Yes, thank you. So I think, in short, the Centre for London view, which is obviously quite widely shared, is that sort of across every aspect of the housing system in London, we're seeing the most acute unaffordability crisis ever. So that starts with homeless families. We know, of course, the latest TA figures have come out recently in the last month. We've seen a jump in the daily spend from councils on temporary accommodation from the £4 million a day that we've been using over the past couple of years to £5.5 million a day. So in the space of 1 year, a jump of over 40%. But that unaffordability crisis continues as you go sort of up the ladder of the housing market. So we also know that when it comes to house price to income ratio, that's at around 12 to 1. That's at the highest level that we've ever seen. So obviously, we know that at the moment there's a big focus on the supply side of this equation. And I think the thing that Centre for London is really keen to profile at the moment that is the fact that this is the supply side is one of two overlapping crises that we face. So one is of supply and one is of sort of distribution and demand side levers as well. So we do need to build more homes, we know that, but we also must fix how housing is used, how it's taxed, how it's financed. So just to put a few figures to the committee to kind of frame that or couch that in some numbers. In terms of that supply side gap, one side of the equation, we know that between 1996 and 2021, the city's population grew by 29%, while housing stock only rose by 23%. We also know that there's been a real, over the same period, affordability distortion. So I mentioned that at the moment, kind of median house price to income ratio sits at around 12 in the capital. Over the same period, that's risen from 4.5 to 12. So we've seen a huge affordability distortion, and it's been inequitable in how it's played out as well. So we know that there's been a huge amount of housing wealth concentration in the capital. So over 65s, just in the last 10 years, have gained £146 billion in housing wealth. And we also know that in 2024, 25% of transactions, property transactions, of course, involved overseas buyers. So that together has created a situation in which house prices have been largely or completely decoupled from local demand, which is an issue. And then on the distribution side, we know that whilst average residential floor space has increased, this has overwhelmingly been concentrated in home ownership, and actually private renter space in the capital has declined. So I suppose as my sort of opening contribution to the panel, I would suggest that inevitably a lot of the political discussion is on supply side measures as well, but there is a massive demand and distribution piece as well that needs to be profiled.
Thank you very much. And actually, before we move on, I'd just like to welcome, we have newly arrived in the public gallery, we have a delegation from the Republic of Korea. So welcome to the London Assembly. We are the Budget and Performance Committee this morning this panel looking at housing issues in London. So in terms of the overall context, I don't know whether Luke or Jonathan, you wanted to add anything on that. My next question is going to be about specifically delivery of affordable housing and what's holding that up. So, Jonathan.
I just think worth emphasising, so I certainly agree with the general picture that Antonia has painted, but things are probably close to an all-time low in terms of market activity. So Molia, who are collect data in this area, are well respected. They put new home sales between Q1 and Q3 of this year at just over 6,000 homes. So there are no transactions basically going on compared to historic levels, which has a knock-on effect on the whole housing supply chain as well as clearly movements within it. But also crucially, there were just over 3,000 starts between Q1 and Q3 this year. And if you were trying to track that against the government's house building target coming in shortly for London, that's roughly 66,000 homes during that period should have kind of appeared. So we're in a bad situation. We desperately need the homes for all the reasons that Antonia talked about, all the way from the issues with temporary accommodation through to just supplying a market that can house those that want to live in London and those that want to work in London. And from a kind of broader business perspective, we think that's a huge issue for London's global competitiveness.
Thanks very much. Luke, and in particular, perhaps you could contribute on this question about affordable or subsidised housing. What are the real blockers to getting that built?
Yeah, I would definitely echo the points, particularly as it relates to temporary accommodation. We know that that's now the largest financial pressure facing boroughs on an annual basis is the affordability crisis and what's that leading to in terms of costs for temporary accommodation. London boroughs are spending £5 million per day on TA, so it's a 30% increase just from last year, which was at least sort of a doubling we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the overall cost of TA that boroughs are managing with all the other struggles they're having. In terms of delivering affordable housing, I think we've seen a few things. We do an annual survey of housing revenue accounts and the position that financial position that they're in. And we very much have seen them still struggling, although interestingly we have seen improvement over the last year. Particularly with some of the recent interventions that the government has made around the 10-year rent settlement, some sort of positive direction at least, and we could probably talk about that more in terms of additional things we'd like to see. But we are really seeing housing revenue accounts struggling still. At least we are seeing over the next 4 years a real pound, about a £300 million reduction, sort of real terms costs in terms of maintenance and affordability. So that's with increasing standards. So, boroughs are really being forced to make really difficult choices between, increasing standards of existing homes, maintaining standards, and then balancing that with the ability to build new homes with all the sort of market conditions that the other panelists have spoken to. So we definitely see a challenging situation, but we also do see, at least I would say, some improvement we're hoping in the year, and there's a number of interventions we're hoping that can help with that I think we can probably speak to.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. Good morning. There's been some really insightful analysis from the Centre for Policy Studies, which showed that 4/5 of homes built in London last year actually received planning permission under Boris Johnson's London plan, and just 1/5 were built under the plans Sir Sadiq Khan has put in place in 2021. So how concerning is that progress insofar that it's so far behind? Who wants to answer that? Jonathan, you said we're in a disastrous situation, which I agree with you completely.
I think what that reflects is the complexity and the slowness of the planning system that we have. And clearly, under the new government, they've been doing things at a national level, and the Mayor has also published his consultation towards a new London plan, which has kind of set out streamlining of processes, potentially, that the new plan will have in terms of policy requirements. But the overall, I think, reflection of that is that often at a national level, and indeed any level, we talk about trying to simplify the planning system, and with every change that comes, actually it makes it more complex. There's a pause, people reflect on how to now navigate their way through the new set of rules, and that causes a slowness in the system. And again, at all levels of government, there is a tendency to just load more policy requirements into planning as well, which sometimes could be dealt outside of planning. And if you put those two things together, coupled with disastrously under-resourced local authority planning departments, because they are having to, divert money to temporary accommodation, to adult social care, the planning budgets get squeezed. You put all that together and you just have a slow planning system. So one hopes that the kind of latest set of reforms will speed the process up. But I think the slowness in output is just a reflection of the fact that if you get consent, you're sort of then wading through a system which doesn't necessarily aid you building out.
Also, I believe there's contradictions in the London plan as it is at the moment. This is what I've been told by developers, and the requirements for double. I'm not a planner.
Dual aspect.
Thank you. I steer well clear of planning on housing.
There are lots of, within any plan, there are lots of competing pressures. And I think anybody kind of building homes understands that. And the reality is now, because of the kind of economics of development, it's a choice in terms of what you prioritise as a local authority, the regional authority in London, in terms of what you want from that scheme. And sometimes when the numbers don't stack up, you have to just simply prioritise what you would ideally want in terms of developer contributions in order to kind of aid the scheme going through. So it's perfectly legitimate to have policies on every aspect that you want, but in reality, you kind of have to match that up with the kind of economics of the time and work out, what you kind of want to prioritise and how much you want to see development happen.
Well, that's right. And we need developers, and some of the comments they've made about this London plan, because no developer wants to build houses to lose money. Let's face it, that's not what they're in that world for. So how can we make building houses more profitable? Because without these developers, we'll never get the houses built. Antonia.
Thank you. I mean, just to, in part, defend the planning system to some extent, or at least raise the profile of the fact that it's not just planning. In the capital, we currently have 300,000 properties with planning permission that are currently not being built. So things, it suggests that planning is not the issue exclusively here. We also know that every global city in the world pretty much blames their planning system for sort of frustrations in the development cycle. The reality, particularly in the London context, is that the cost of land has skyrocketed. The amount of subsidy available per unit through the Affordable Homes Programme simply isn't enough for it to be viable for developers to build. And you're right to raise the profile of the fact that it is not the Labour Party that builds homes, it is the developers, and they will go ahead if schemes are viable and they're not under, of course, any obligation to build if those profit margins don't work for them. But as I said, the reality is in the capital, the cost of land has gone through the roof. I believe now 70% of the costs associated with any new development are connected to land. Obviously, we know that we have a huge skills deficit. So whilst it's been very welcome to see the uplift to the Affordable Homes Programme and kind of guarantees around the next sort of 10 years of it, in our conversations with developers and, RPs, residential providers, housing associations, they are not able to hit the ground running at the moment, given the skills deficit that the capital currently faces in the construction industry. We also know, on top of that, of course, that other costs associated with development have also skyrocketed, and we can sort of debate the merits of increased fire and safety regulation or, increased environmental provision. But the reality is they are there at the moment, and we would suggest by and large they're welcome, and they're needed as sort of part of the development journey to make us safer and more close to our net zero target of 2030 as a city, which is rapidly approaching. So I guess I just sort of wanted to raise the profile of those things and flag that from the Centre for London perspective, one of the biggest things that would assist with this bottleneck at the moment is increasing the subsidy allowed per unit via the Affordable Homes Programme to developers. We've heard that consistently that is one of the biggest barriers to development in the capital. So we'd really urge kind of the GLA and all of those involved with that cycle to look at that.
Okay, has anybody got any other ideas on how we can make it more attractive to build houses? Because we depend on these developers.
Well, I would echo the points that have been made, but to stress that I think the biggest cost is construction. Construction inflation has increased massively, the build cost, and that is hard to control. Now, a proportion of that you can attribute to public policy decisions and requirements, but that is a small proportion probably of the overall challenge of the fact that, raw materials, skills, labour, etc. have rocketed. So that impacts anybody, regardless if you are a private entity or a local authority building, and hence why you've seen, universally all types of builders decline. And then I think you're sort of into other areas that Antonia mentioned in terms of the regulatory process, in its worth, particularly emphasising the building safety regulator and the gateway process, which has come in now. It's a new process, and you're supposed to get your gateway 2 process. This is your permission to start construction within 12 weeks, and nobody has received permission within 12 weeks. And there's a lot of discussion about why that is, and the government, again, have acknowledged that it's an under-resourced process and it's probably an overly complex process. Everybody agrees you need this process, you just need to properly resource it. So, that regulatory process is not working as it should, and it is holding up schemes which arguably are viable. So, we really want those permissions to be built. But if you're stuck in a system that you cannot tell your contractor to just hold on for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, and you've got no certainty, there's not a huge amount of dialogue in that process, that's a huge risk that I think people aren't willing to navigate. Or if they are navigating it, ultimately it's costing the scheme to hold on to that land, to try and hold on to resources and the material, and that again has a negative impact on the viability. I think the only thing I would add, and I absolutely don't want to appear critical of the planning system, planning process. I agree with Antonia, there are lots of other reasons why schemes aren't being built, but we shouldn't sort of just bash planning. But I think the kind of number of schemes that aren't built is sometimes misunderstood, as if these schemes are just ready to go and somebody just needs to build them and they're deliberately not building them. And I just do not see that from the kind of market feedback that we're getting from our members and through sort of wider discussions, that is the case. There are a lot of schemes that do have planning permission, but they just are not viable, so you cannot build them. And again, regardless of what type of entity you are, if you are a local authority or if you're a private sector developer, you cannot build something which is loss-making.
So do you think this is why then, very sadly, that permission has been given to build on the green belt. Do you think they're saying that now just so that it'll look like there's more area to build on? If there's so many areas that we could be building on, but we're not because of all of the reasons that you've said, why are we then giving people the green belt, which very many of us don't approve of going, when there's so many issues as to why we're not building on the land that we've already got?
I wouldn't necessarily associate those two issues together. I mean, I think the arguments why, and I declare here that we're keen that existing old pieces of the green belt that serve no environmental purpose and that are previously built on could be used for development if they are close to existing stations, which there are some. I think the reasons why you do that are because of the kind of coming back to the start of the discussion, which is we just have huge housing need in London, and we have a crisis in supply, and that's then therefore manifesting itself in a terrible situation of homelessness and temporary accommodation. So I think sensibly looking at reusing parts of our sort of land which aren't environmentally protected, and the Greenbelt is not an environmental designation, then I think that's sensible. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prioritising brownfield sites, absolutely. But the evidence would suggest that even if you do that, you won't ever deliver the number of homes that we need.
But you're saying that there is an awful lot out there. You gave some numbers, Antonio, forgive me, I've forgotten, that are ready, that could be built on because it's been given permission or it's ready to go. And it's not being. Why aren't we concentrating on dealing with that log jam first?
I would say absolutely concentrate that. And even if you did unlock that, you would still have a huge housing need. The scale of London's housing need is so big.
There's no question on the need.
Getting more land in the market would be a good thing for us.
There's no question on the need. The fact is, if there's a log jam now on land that we can build on, providing more land that is contentious, because many of us do not approve of using the green belt, why don't we concentrate on all the issues that are there at the moment as to why we're not building? I mean, industry data shows that private house building, which has already declined significantly, is effectively going to grind to a halt by 2027. Given that we know that the scale of the problem and what it is, what can we do to avoid this?
I mean, I basically echo Jonathan's comments in the sense that this isn't a either-or dynamic, in my opinion, in the sense that it's not we go for, strategically optimal areas of the green belt, obviously the grey belt, as it's currently been known, or we focus on accelerating those properties with planning permission through the development cycle. We, given the scale of the crisis, need to be pulling at every lever all at once, essentially. As I outlined in my opening remarks, temporary accommodation costs have jumped around, 40%.
Yeah.
We're in a situation now when it comes to just the TA crisis where we might see the capital's first council go bankrupt in the next year under the pressure of TA costs. We're already in a position where councils in the capital, a quarter of councils in the capital rely on emergency borrowing funds. This is possibly going to essentially, bankrupt local government, at scale, at pace.
Antonia, nobody's disagreeing with you. We all know we've got to build more houses. It's been abysmal under Sadiq Khan, absolutely abysmal. And bearing in mind, billions have gone into this. From the last government alone, we need to unlock that logjam, and that's what I've been trying to get from you, what the logjam is. I know I'm over my time, Chair, so I'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to, because there's clearly a contradiction, or perhaps there is, I don't mean to start a row between guests, but between what Antonia said and what Jonathan said. And I think I align myself entirely with what Antonia said, because you're looking at, market factors, which is the overall biggest issue. I mean, if we're just, and I think just on one thing, Jonathan, I've been a councillor for 12 years. If a local authority wants to build something, I know planning committees aren't meant to be whipped, but we all know the reality. I don't think I'm letting state secrets out. If they want it to be built, it's going to be built and it's going to get planning permission. It'll be the way that they want it. I mean, that's the reality. But I think if we're looking at market factors which impact on the costs with the affordable housing programme, you know, we know there's going to be a housing crash probably over the next year. Inner London prices have fallen off a cliff, and that's now creeping out to outer London. And one of the things that nobody seems to be talking about at the moment, which impacts the affordable housing programme, is the fact of minor examples like the 3,000% increase in waste disposal. That's going to add on average an extra £24,000 per unit. You know, then we look at interest rates as well, which I don't think anyone's mentioned yet. In addition to that, we're looking at, you know, I think Jonathan, you said the scale of what we have to build has never been done before. I mean, we're talking 88,000 a year, even post-war. That's never been done in this city, let alone anywhere else in the country. So I'd come back to my point, and I appreciate I've singled out Jonathan and Antonia, so briefly, if you could just talk about it, is given what the GLA can actually do, is it worth providing more an affordable housing grant to get these developments off the scheme in order to offset market costs? Because that's, in terms of actual public policy, that's the only thing that can be done. I don't see any other way around it.
So, yeah, briefly, yes, I would suggest that that is a good idea. And I think part of the debate around this centres on the fact that when it comes to things such as managing our portion, London's portion of the Affordable Homes Programme, the GLA is stuck somewhere between having a truly devolved policy and a delegated policy with too many remits around it and too many kind of controls around what can and can't be done with it. So I would suggest that there is scope to advocate for true devolution and the grant to be given to the GLA to manage with, you know, as few strings attached as possible. Essentially, I think, you know, London's building environment, for all the reasons that we've just spoken about, is completely unique in the country, and so having formula that come from national government that sit across the country just don't fully apply there. You're right also to raise the profile of interest rates and their impact on the market. We know essentially that relatively low interest rates have meant that housing in London is more attractive an investment, and again that's been another driver to decouple local demand from house prices in the capital, so that needs to be looked at. And the other thing that I mentioned briefly in my opening remarks that I just wanted to spend a short moment talking about is making better use of existing stock, and I think that's another lever where more could be done. We know that in the capital there are 20,000 long-term vacant homes. We know predominantly they sit within privately owned homes as opposed to the rental market. So I think the stat is 37% of owner-occupied homes are currently under-occupied. That's, you know, that's over a third, and we know that the barriers to changing that largely come in the form of sort of tax disincentives, essentially. It's, you know, it's no secret that council tax is a regressive and out-of-date tax. And again, I would suggest when it comes to that devolution pitch to central government, suggesting that both kind of stamp duty, land tax, is devolved to London, and we also have the ability to reform council tax dramatically, would be massively useful in helping this underutilisation of stock issue.
Yeah, I think so. On the question of could we have more money go into affordable housing, I mean, yes, please, that would be fantastic. It's a choice in terms of, you know, central government spending more money. They've just announced a record settlement, or in terms of the length at least, so that the 2026 programme, which will eventually come into being, London will have £11.75 billion over 10 years or so to invest in affordable housing. That's great. Could we do with more? Yes. Is it hard to get that money from government? I think the answer is yes. So what I'd say is, you know, the state kind of pumping in money to affordable housing is a necessity. you cannot build affordable housing without some kind of subsidy. But also we need to look at how you tap into long-term institutional funding from the private sector that can also play a role in funding affordable housing. And there are deals being done in this space through for-profit registered providers, but also institutional money just coming into supporting the traditional housing associations as well. So if we could up the grant rate per unit, that would be fantastic. It's contingent on money from the government. It doesn't look like we're going to get any more money than we've currently got in terms of what the spending review announced. So I think we need to reorientate the way that we look at the programme and the policies that we have to also encourage institutional money in, which would increase, hopefully, the overall spend, at least, on affordable housing in London.
Just, Chair, just one comment to say, just to make clear, my comment wasn't asking the government for more money. It was creating greater liquidity in the market with the current programme funding that we have. You know, that was the point, because I think going back to Antonia's point, there's too many restrictions attached to a lot of these things. Therefore, the liquidity is not as free-flowing as it should be. So I think that was more my point. No, and I'm
misunderstood. Yeah. And as Antonia says, that is, you know, it's not entirely in the hands of the GLA. There are outputs agreed with the government. I do understand that where people are going in and having conversations now, there is an element of flexibility being shown, and grant per unit, you know, is perhaps higher than it was because the situation demands it. So I think there is some element of that being recognised within the constraints of the overall system that they operate in.
Thanks. We've got this impending 88,000 target per year, total house building. What would you say roughly is the right balance between affordable stroke subsidised housing and market housing within that target? If any of you have a view on that. Only because you've talked about increasing the subsidy per unit, which inevitably reduces the total number of units. And in the context of 88,000 a year, you know, even a third of that is well in excess of the current available subsidy.
I think that the interesting thing about this is that it is a mediated target. So it's not a pure need. It's what the planning system, this will be tested, right? So this target will go through the examination process and the planning inspectorate, and, you know, they will have to sort of justify this number, although clearly the government have come out with a formula which sort of has led to this. So I kind of think we know the answer, but nonetheless, there is a process which goes on. That is not pure need. You know, that is what can we deliver in London, given all the constraints that we talked about, you know, the amount of land that we have and stuff. So, in some respects, you can come up with a pure kind of need in terms of affordable housing, and it's going to be really high. And so I think, you know, what I'd say is that what we need is to be pragmatic. I think what we absolutely want to see is more affordable homes in London, and whatever the best way is to deliver that, from a kind of private sector perspective, I think we should do that. What we want to see is the overall number, you know, increase. Private developers really value affordable housing. It is effectively a pre-sale. And if you can't contract at the start with an RP, then you're in trouble, because you can't sort of just deliver your scheme full stop, because you obviously have to have a registered provider support your affordable requirements. So I think we just need to be pragmatic. So sort of less concerned with, you know, what sort of the official numbers say or what percentages are, and we should be concerned to increase the overall volume of development, which I think hopefully would increase the overall number of affordable homes.
Is that an argument for reducing the percentage in order to get things built?
Well, I think the challenge at the moment is that anybody getting permission and building is probably not going through the fast-track process. They are going through the viability mediated process, which is, you know, that process kind of works to some extent because you've got two options. The challenge is that regardless of that process, we're just not seeing the level of output we want. So if we can show some flexibility, potentially in the percentage of affordable, we would hope that that would be done so in a way which increases the overall output over a period of time. Okay. Nobody, I think, in the private sector wants to see a minimal number of affordable homes. They want to deliver a kind of a level which is appropriate to what they can contribute.
Okay. It's just, it seems to be a major cause of hold-ups and viability, and nobody wants to say, let's just cut the number and get a building. Anybody want to say that?
Well, I think there are live discussions
you sort of
going
not
on,
said that,
and one would hope within, potentially this week, next week, soon, that there may well be some movement in that space.
Everybody seems to want somebody else to say it, is my observation. Antonia?
Thanks. I'm not going to say it, but just to fly the flag for a couple of wider points in this debate. The first thing to say is that many developers who go through the fast-track process with the 35% affordable within the proposal don't end up delivering the 35%, and indeed almost in build the fine for not meeting that target into the development costs. So I think a real priority just needs to be making sure that the number of affordable homes that are guaranteed are actually delivered, and there are not ways around that process. Second thing I'd say is affordable, obviously, as a definition of being 80% of market rate is obviously not genuinely affordable. And at Centre for London, we're doing a lot of work to just try and promote the value and the need for social homes and move away from this affordable definition. And then the other thing that I just also wanted to say was the fact that what we know is extremely lacking in the London sort of development world at the moment is development of family-size homes, particularly when it comes to inner London. And so I think perhaps to justify that, one thing that could be done is a much more granular, detailed analysis of the social housing waiting lists that are sat within each borough at the moment. So we know at the moment that in many boroughs, if you're looking for a family-sized home, you can expect to wait over 10 years until you can get that home. Obviously, at that stage, you're not waiting. It's a failed system and you're looking elsewhere. And indeed, the structure of your family over that period is likely to change incredibly, and at the end of which you might not even need the family-sized home. So to that end, I wonder if there is scope to do a more granular analysis of who is sat on those social housing waiting lists, sort of more than just the top-line information we currently have, understanding about their future plans, future income potential, future aspirations when it comes to moving, for example, and all of these things could come together to produce a much more intelligent allocation system that potentially could work, for example, on a sub-regional basis, not a borough-to-borough basis, where the boroughs classify their own bands, for example.
Okay, thanks very much. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. Jonathan, can I just understand, you said earlier that you don't think developers are sitting on land from your market feedback. Are you concerned about land banking at all?
Well, I think this is a often discussed issue. Evidence generally shows that land banking, as in I am deliberately sitting on a piece of land and I am holding it back and I will wait for 2, 3, 4, 5 years before I start construction, because then I think I will make more money when I develop later on. The evidence in studies done by the CMA and by the Letwin Review originally suggests that that isn't happening. But what I would say is, if there is evidence of that, you should go and compulsory purchase that land. I think the public sector should use its powers where there is clear evidence of somebody, say, for example, deliberately holding a piece of land back that was stalling a town centre regeneration. If there's evidence there to suggest that, let's use the powers of the state to intervene. The general evidence suggests that that isn't happening as frequently as some people perceive.
Because listening to this conversation, if I'm a developer and my motive is profit, if that's more profitable to sit on the land, then why would I build the house?
Well, because generally the cost that goes into buying the land, and you then have an asset on your books that you're not putting through production, that's actually costing you money. It's your cost of capital, all the sort of implications of just holding onto a piece of land and not building. That's not the way that market operators generally act. You know, once they're desperate to get through and recycle their capital and move on to the next scheme. There are many different types of developers that operate in different ways, but generally, you know, the model is to kind of get your cash in and get your cash out, and therefore you need to build.
So there are some developers who you think are probably land banking?
Well, as I say, the evidence by the CMA and others says that generally land banking is not an issue, and I'm not here to defend anybody that does land bank. We're pretty clear as an organisation that if you are deliberately land banking, somebody should go and do something about that. If we can find the evidence, let's go and tackle it, absolutely.
Thank you. Luke, can I move on to you? So there's been rumours around the change to the affordable housing programme. It's a leading question. I'm trying to find a way of not leading, but is this a risk? And what risk would it be if we're building less affordable houses?
I think it is a potential risk. I mean, I would echo the point around additional flexibilities, taking into account the situation in London, and not having a sort of one-size-fits-all for the program is really critical for local authorities as well, and particularly that issue around increasing the the contribution levels. So that's really important to being able to make local authority social housing schemes be viable and move ahead. I mean, the other point that I'd emphasize that we've called for at London councils and been very vocal about is social rents and social rent policy, particularly around rent convergence. We think this is a really critical piece that would be required for unlocking social development within housing revenue accounts for local authorities. So pushing for, and this is work we've done with the G15 and others, for an increase of £3 rent convergence at £3 per week is really critical, and at least the analysis we've shown is a bit of a tipping point that allows HRAs to both invest in stock quality, which is really critical, as well as start building social homes again.
Thank you. And we've had a conversation today about the subsidy model. In your opinion, Luke, is the subsidy model an effective way of funding the affordable house programme?
I mean, I think the more can be done, right? I think we need, certainly, I think as an organization, we were very pleased to see the big investment in the affordable homes program, and but we do really want to see flexibility around that subsidy. So I think, that's really critical, I think, for us. Yeah.
Thanks. And sorry, I keep asking you questions. We've heard from Antonio and Jonathan in terms of they preempted my question. Home acquisitions, how important a part should this play in an affordable housing programme?
I think we're seeing it more and more as a really important piece, particularly around temporary accommodation. So we've talked about how much of a pressure that is, and boroughs are really looking at, every way they can to manage those temporary accommodation costs. Home acquisition being one of them that we're seeing boroughs increasingly do. Particularly, you'll be aware of the issue around LHA rates and the capping of those rates for temporary accommodation. That's a massive cost shunt from central government onto local authorities. Home acquisition, if done properly, is a way to be able to charge full LHA rates for temporary accommodation. So it's a tool that boroughs are increasingly using to sort of manage those TA costs. Obviously, the broader structural things that we've talked about are really important to sort of manage that crisis, but as it exists, it's a really important piece in terms of particularly managing TA. Yeah.
Antonio, could I just ask you finally about the value of money for home acquisition compared to building new build? Or value for money, sorry. the value for money of acquisition properties as opposed to new build?
Sure. I mean, do you mean for an individual?
Subsidising new build.
Oh, I see. I mean, I don't have loads of evidence on that, I have to admit, but from what I understand, the subsidy model is still kind of cost effective, particularly in light of kind of new regulation that's come through with regards to low carbon new build and indeed fire and safety regulation. But I have to admit, I don't have figures on that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thanks.
Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thanks, Chair. So we've heard time and time again in terms of we're facing an unprecedented housing situation. Antonia, your opening comments made that incredibly clear. You talked about the £5.5 million a day that's being spent on temporary accommodation by London councils, which is just a horrific amount of money to be wasting on, in many cases, insufficient quality temporary accommodation for families. And when we see 1 in 20 children in London living in temporary accommodation, it's an absolute disgrace that we are having to deal with this situation. You've all set out what an absolute perfect storm this is in terms of the housing building situation is absolute crisis, and so many levers that need to be pulled. Just first of all, in terms of going back to the subsidy point, how can we make sure that we are using the subsidy as best as possible to build the family-sized accommodation that's required to get us and all of those London families out of the position that they're in at the moment?
I won't pretend to be an expert on the how you design the affordable housing programme, but essentially it is a question of if you want certain outcomes, you skew the programme to deliver them. The challenge will be the cost of delivering family-sized homes, which are obviously larger, and that there's a balance to be struck between total number of homes you want versus the size of homes you want, and etc. But if you're kind of focused on delivering family-orientated homes, then you would skew the programme to deliver that.
And presumably, because at the moment the system is that London councils have to bid for the funding in order to get the to then use the subsidy locally, there'd be a direct correlation between obviously spend on either acquisition or building of these family-sized accommodation versus cost avoidance in terms of temporary accommodation. Has anybody done any work in terms of how that business case stacks up?
I think I can speak to that a bit. I mean, I think there are complications around, what's funded from the general fund, what's funded from the housing revenue account. I think what we have seen is that the cost of temporary accommodation is so high that almost any scheme is delivering a cost benefit right away, whether that's acquisition of homes or long-term leases, or using properties in a local authority's HRA to manage TA. So we see boroughs doing all of those techniques, and it is very much sort of local factors that determine what the best mix is. But I think the point being that really managing that cost of TA is really essential. So you've got the demand, but you've also got just the cost pressures. So I think there's lots, I mentioned the point about LHA rates, but I think there is a lot of work that can be done across the system to encourage private landlords and to incent more in the system, and also just reduce that overall cost of TA, which is really critical.
Yeah, sorry, Antonia, maybe as part of your answer as well, we talked about compulsory purchase of potentially land, but actually I think you'd raised the point about the number of empty homes there are across London as well. Is there an opportunity in terms of making sure that we bring those back into use? I mean, a significant shift away from house building to acquisitions over the last year or so in order to close that gap. Is there an opportunity there?
Yes, there's definitely a huge opportunity there. So we know that, as I've mentioned, sort of council tax reforms would be a huge incentive to address under occupation. There's also the potential to sort of expand grants to support downsizing and/or co-living schemes. Other measures might include the reformation of right-to-buy receipts to allow boroughs to reinvest locally. And then more generally, the Central Fund position is that we do support sort of more gentle densification kind of across garden plots, conversions, that sort of thing. Just briefly on the last point, yeah, I just wanted to raise the fact that obviously the £5.5 million a day is horrendous. You know, we're still just about the richest capital city and the richest city in Europe. You know, the fact that we're in this position is disgraceful. But obviously, the £5.5 million a day translates to many households that are, you know, currently being housed under this scheme. So there isn't really the opportunity, obviously, to just like for like take that cash and spend it elsewhere. But I think that does raise the question of whether a kind of one-off injection of cash to kind of accelerate that transition might be needed, alongside, as Luke was saying, a real scaling of all the alternative methods that some councils have started using to manage the TA crisis. So I think of, for example, Kensington and Chelsea that have recently flexed some of their pension fund, £100 million from their pension fund, to buy 250 temporary accommodation properties permanently to be owned by the borough. That's a really interesting scheme, obviously very much in line with the white paper that came out from government a few years ago around using pension funds to invest locally. I would raise the profile of the fact that that is £100 million for 250 properties, equating to £4 million a property. It's not massively economical as it stands.
Just to move away from grants onto the point of potentially, so the government could act as a guarantor or you know, to lend the funds to RPs who've currently seen their credit ratings drop, I think, pretty much universally, and hence why part of the reason why they've gone out of the market of home building. Is there an opportunity to use, as well as the AHP that we've got in terms of giving grants, other streams of funding to provide those loans to make sure that we're building?
Yeah, I think you can't overstate the challenge that housing associations in particular had, and I think that, you know, acknowledging that they're just being hit from every direction, so it is entirely understandable where they find themselves. The government, at the spending review, of course, also did set the sort of social rents RPI. I think it was +1. I can't remember now. The figure's gone out of my head, but that, given that long-term certainty, has helped. And they did also announce the creation of National Housing Bank with the ability to offer guarantees and loans. How that plays out in terms of London is not clear yet, but they did also announce within that they're working with the Greater London Authority to establish the City Hall Developer Investment Fund. And Business London, as an organisation, has done quite a lot of advocacy on supporting the idea that City Hall could create some kind of developer platform, and I think it would be right that creating that platform would focus on delivering affordable housing, and if the way that you do that is by offering, you know, a range of interventions, one of those being guarantees or loans to kind of kickstart activity in that space, then I think that is definitely something that should be pursued, and I know that, you know, thoughts are going on now about how you develop that. So I would hope that something is coming soon in that space.
That's really positive to hear. My final question is really in terms of, you know, we heard at Labour Party conference, Build Baby Build from Steve Reed. We, of course, GLA, quite a unique circumstance in terms of also owning quite substantial amounts of land across London as well. How can we better coordinate in order to make sure that we use that land to, you know, really bring impetus to this home building programme?
Well, just quickly, I don't want to sort of allow the others to speak as well, but I do think this City Hall developer could play that kind of unifying role Lord Kerslake wrote a review a while ago looking at kind of the GLA land portfolio and saying, how can we use this more effectively? And one of his recommendations was that there's this kind of internal coordination role to be played. And I think the creation of a kind of central hub that looks at that land, but crucially reaches out to other parts of the public sector. And that's where I think the private sector struggle is getting into an NHS trust and getting into, the police authority or the fire. Actually, City Hall is well placed to potentially do that. And I think that coordination role, matched by the powers that the mayor has in planning, investment, and the skills and capabilities of those of the GLA, that could be a powerful outfit to kind of hang your hat on and push on housing, and we'd be keen to see that happen.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I don't have much to add. Just two short things. Firstly, that I believe through the GLAP, that's what it is. Yeah, GLAP. There's over 600 hectares of potential developable land, and that's been modelled out to potentially unlock space for up to 68,000 homes by the 2040s. That's that's a massive part of London's wider target, and at risk of sort of teeing up the next panel too nicely. However, the blocker is coordinating this with transport, of course, and so I would suggest, and Central London's position would be that those two need to be obviously dovetailed as much as possible and expedited as well.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other indications, so that brings to an end our second panel, which has been on housing. We'll now take a short adjournment of 5 minutes until 12 minutes past by my watch, when we'll return to look at transport. Thanks, everyone. Okay, welcome back to the third and final panel of this morning's Budget and Performance Committee with our panel of outside experts looking at the Mayor's budget for the upcoming year. Our third panel is on transport, so I'll kick off. Apologies, I haven't welcomed our new guests. So on our third panel, we have Antonia Jennings, who is still the CEO for Centre for London, and Luke Hillam from London Councils, and Jonathan Seeger from Business London, who remain from our second panel. And joining us afresh are Professor Tony Travers, who's the Professor in Practice and Associate Dean. Is that new? I'm sure I didn't say that last time. Congratulations, if so. It's not new. They've just added it to my script. Okay. Well, congratulations in any case from the LSE, and Michael Roberts, who's the CEO of London Travel Watch. Welcome all. So I kick off with a broad question about TfL's finances. What are the biggest risks to TfL's finances in the coming year, and how can the sort of upcoming budget make that TfL's finances more resilient? Who would like to kick off? Tony.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to come and give evidence to the committee today. I mean, the threats to TfL's budgets, like many public sector organisations, I think boil down to the continued pressure on ridership, which, as you know, the committee knows, is still well below the levels that were predicted before the pandemic, and that has a phenomenally powerful downward bad impact on revenues as compared with what was expected 6 years ago. So I think that's the first thing, ridership and the challenge to finances that brings. Second, there is a so-called fair funding review that local government is going through, which will be implemented from April next year, which affects the boroughs as well as the Greater London Authority. We don't know what the outcomes of that are going to be. We do know that these figures for many boroughs don't look great. TfL and City Hall's figures we know even less about. They're subject to more negotiation, I suspect. But so that's another issue to keep in mind, the outcome of the fair funding review. And of course, linked to the first of those, but not the second, is just the general health of the London economy. If London's economy is growing, GDP and productivity are growing, then it will allow ridership and therefore fare income to grow. But in recent years, disposable income hasn't been growing fast, and that's meant that in addition to the pandemic effect, which has clearly made it harder for TfL to generate revenues, revenues are rising far, far less quickly than they did in the last decade or the one before that. So those, I think, are the key issues. So it's really sort of ridership, the fair funding review, and the London and UK economies more generally.
So in light of that, you think the Mayor's decision, obviously freezing fares for a number of years, has obviously increased that pressure? Is that, in hindsight, is that
as always,
additional pressure?
A fares freeze, or not putting fares up as in line with inflation, will produce less revenue than would otherwise have been the case. And as I think I said last year, it's a political decision, but inevitably it has the consequence that at the margin, the financial situation is just that little bit more difficult than if those fares were rising in line with inflation, or, as I think is now required more or less by central government, inflation plus. I think the governments are expecting more than inflation. So, yeah, I mean, you know, if fares went up more, there'd be more revenue. Well, actually, subject to the elasticity, which I think is now tighter than it will have been in the past.
Thanks very much. Michael, welcome. What did you have to add on sort of risks facing TfL in the year ahead?
A supplementary to Tony's point about passenger income revenue, an additional risk, which is around cost, and maybe a nuance on the point about retained business rate income. On the first point, very much endorse what Tony said about revenue from public transport services not coming in as certainly was the case in previous years and as expected. And that was my particular kind of concern, just comparing where we were at this point last year when TfL submitted their submission to the GLA budget, and they did anticipate an increase in revenue from passenger services for this year, but it has fallen, or it looks like it's going to fall well short of the actual forecast by about £90 million for this year. So that's a significant gap, and that then begs questions about what's the scale of operating surplus that's going to be carried over, and the opportunity for that then to finance investment in things that are very necessary, for example, but not just renewals. The second point is an additional risk for me is what's going on around cost, because again, the outturn on costs, operating costs for TfL, looks to be turning out significantly worse than originally anticipated, again, compared with this point last year. To be fair, TfL did then anticipate that costs would rise in this coming year, but the increase has turned out to be significantly more than what they had anticipated by an additional £185 million if the latest forecasts are correct. Another big hole in funding. Third point, the nuance around business rate retention, which I think Tony is right to flag as a potential risk. There was something that just caught my eye, and maybe I misread it, but in the Spending Review 2025 letter to TfL from the government, and the sentence that caught my eye, quote unquote, was, "This settlement is in addition to the business rates that you're able to retain. The levels for transport purposes will be in line with recent years." A signal of comfort. What does in line really mean? Not quite sure, but perhaps the signal that the risk is not as great as might otherwise be feared.
Thanks very much. Antonia, Luke or Jonathan, did you want to add anything on risk to TfL finances in the year ahead or the outturn of the spending review? It's not obligatory, you don't have to.
The only thing I'd add is that, and this is mine, I suppose, in the grand scheme of the overall budget, but there's provisions for bad debt. That's been going up year on year, and I think they're hoping to kind of make a chunk into that. But it's a challenge to do that. It's not easy to do, and there's just a potential risk there. But I would certainly echo the points that have been made. It's well established that we rely on the fare box, and so that takes a huge risk.
Yeah. The bad debt actually is something we were quizzing them about, particularly last year. It seems to have gone up in line with ULEZ expanding and additional ULEZ income expected. It seems to have gone up in tandem with their bad debt, which is not quite the same as saying that that's the cause of it. They're a bit vague about that. In terms of Antonia.
Thanks. Just briefly and echoing sort of others' comments, one thing I would raise the profile of is the fact that TfL is quite exceptional amongst global cities in having such a high reliance on fares. So I think around 55% of TfL's budget comes from fares, and that compares to just under 40% in the sort of Paris and New York equivalents. That's exacerbated by the fact that, as others have remarked, we have the business rate supplement and the mayoral transport precept, and they both raise around 1.1 billion, but both of these, of course, are politically sensitive and capped. So that's, another kind of limitation, a limitation there. Something that Centre of London's long advocated for is replacing sort of fragmented charges such as the ULEZ with a distance-based road user charging scheme. We suggest this is both more progressive as a policy, given we are in the somewhat converse situation at the moment whereby if, and appreciate the GLA is concerned with the Greater London boundary, but if you do live just outside of that and you have a destination just inside the Greater London boundary that you need to travel to, let's say a B&Q, or there's another one 20 miles away, but you can avoid the ULEZ fare, that is essentially incentivising longer journeys. But so there's both the fairness point around it, I suppose, but also the modelling has shown that a road user charging system could raise up to £2 billion a year, alongside, of course, reducing congestion.
Okay, I don't think we want to get into per mile road user charging. I can hear people wanting to bring up questions. I will merely add that it's quite politically contentious for any mayor to contemplate. Assembly Member Polanski.
Political genius, I would say. Antonia, what can TfL do to accelerate efforts to achieve net zero?
We've seen through sort of analysing the GLA budgets that capital investment has fallen almost 20%, almost 40% since 2015. And we've also seen that delays to things such as the Bakerloo line extension, DLR to Thamesmead, etc., jeopardise both housing and productivity goals. I say all of that. Obviously, I know that's somewhat separate to climate, but I will link it because our position is that the climate budget must be fully integrated into capital planning. And so just to put forward the other part of this argument, which is around the climate budget. So the Mayor's climate budget currently identifies transport as the single largest source of citywide emissions. And we know that decarbonisation of the network requires up to £6 billion for the bus fleet by 2030 and over £2 billion for station and depot retrofits and grid upgrades. So our position is that the climate budget must be fully integrated into capital planning and not siloed as any sort of green premium. We also advocate for multi-year funding for zero emissions buses and also last mile delivery infrastructure in the capital. And we'd also suggest there's a sort of suite of, I suppose, no regrets investments that TfL could make, which would include sort of upgrading signalling, step-free access, cycle superhighways, orbital routes, etc., that could all sit under an integrated climate and capital planning budget.
Sounds like lots of jobs to me. Thank you. Michael, can I pick up on Antonia's point about a multi-year settlement? How important is that in terms of both, well, obviously funding TfL, but also reaching these goals of reaching net zero?
I think having greater predictability of funding is important to, well, all of the goals in the mayoral transport strategy, including the net zero goal. I think the route to net zero from a transport point of view is, I think, conceptually relatively simple. So increase the modal shift from more polluting forms of transport to less polluting forms, including public transport, not just, though, as we move to electric vehicles on the roads. Make sure that the fleet of buses is zero emission, and also to ensure that the energy that is purchased by TfL to power the network is carbon-free or low carbon. And all of these things are in the mayoral transport strategy. Broadly supportive of all of those things. If there is a but, there is a cost associated with some of these things, at least an upfront cost, although over time one might expect that the cost of the economy to be recovered. But, for example, moving the bus fleet to zero emission by 2030, which is the mayor's target, implies a faster rate of replacement of buses compared with the replacement rate over the previous years. And I'm not saying that's not necessarily a bad thing, but a more intensive bus replacement programme that has been applied previously, that price tag has to be balanced against all the other priorities that the mayor has in front of him. And so, again, as with many of the other choices, there's a political choice to make.
Well, it's interesting you say but, because I would see that as an and, because really we know the cost of inaction and also there's huge opportunities here for jobs again, right?
Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it.
OK, I'll take that. And sorry, could I ask you finally as well? So in terms of, you just mentioned energy, we know that TfL have a power purchase agreement, but it's about 5 to 10% of renewable energy. Is there a danger of still an over-reliance on fossil fuels in terms of, with the global insecurity, that's going to push up prices?
I think that's outside my bailiwick.
OK.
I'd love to answer, but we haven't really got an insight into that.
Totally appreciate that. Thank you. Tony, you're someone who has seen various mayors and governments in various combinations. We've got a government that are talking about airport expansion, and we had a meeting in the Environment Committee a few days ago that talked about the kind of carbon headroom being taken from lots of different buckets. Is there a risk here that the push to net zero at a London level gets completely undermined by national planning?
Well, there's no doubt that the national growth priority, which is obviously work in progress, which involves expansion potentially of one airport inside London and 2 or more within the London ambit, one or more outside London, but still in the London airport system. I mean, clearly, the policy of trying to deliver growth and the policy of reducing the use of carbon are, to some extent, going to be fighting each other. You know that better than I do. And so it's a matter of trading priorities between growth and environmental sustainability. All I would say is, coming back to Michael's point, discussion of the issue, it is worth just remembering that London produces huge amounts of economic output in a relatively environmentally sustainable way compared with almost anywhere in the world, in the sense that such a large proportion of people go to work by public transport, travel for leisure by public transport, but the sort of GDP in relation to the amount of energy used must be very low by the standards of anywhere else in the UK. And I think, you know, we must always bear in mind that the embedded past investment in public transport over 150 years has paid off that dividend.
Yes, and Shell, BP, Reliance, lots of fossil fuel companies based in London, and we have the City of London here. So there's still always more we can do, and it's about global leadership, right?
Well, you know, where companies locate is where companies locate. And again, we're in the sense of where, it's not just where they locate, but what they do by way of, you know, again, better than I do, by way of their investments. So I think for economic output purposes, most people in the room would think companies locating in London was a good thing. Question of how they invest their money, if they're fuel and energy companies, is a separate issue besides.
Thank you. I realise I'm drifting off transport, so thank you very much. Thanks.
So, Assembly Member Georgiou.
Panel, just so you're aware, I'm about to trigger Assembly Member Polanski. We've had a proposal that £8 billion from one of our guests should be spent on net zero efforts for TfL. And I guess my question, would that money not be better spent on actually getting people from A to B and getting them to their jobs, getting them to their offices from their homes, and actually contributing to London's economy? Is that not a far more effective way of spending money rather than going for net zero on the transport network?
I think the trouble is the money doesn't exist. I mean, if you've got £8 billion to spend, the question of if there was an £8 billion pot to spend, there's a separate issue about the extent of resources available for transport in London to invest in anything. And if we had £8 billion, we could then decide whether it should be spent on making more of the city net zero, or whether it should be invested in new projects to allow more people to travel by public transport, which would have the same effect, of course, but in a different way. So I think that the difficulty with the question is, not only do we not have that kind of £8 billion, but separately, the amount of money that's been made available for TfL looking ahead is nowhere near enough, even to improve the existing infrastructure and to stop it depreciating faster than it requires resources just to keep it up to date, if that makes sense. So, you know, the Bakerloo line trains need replacing yesterday. And so that's what I would say in answer to this question. If we had £8 billion, then we could decide how to spend it.
Jonathan, I see.
Just to add to that, we did a kind of lot of advocacy, and many did, to try and get TfL its capital spending settlement from government. You know, that amounts to 2.2 billion up until 2030. That's great, but it's not a lot of money in terms of the needs that we have across the network, particularly when, and without dragging us back into the previous session, but particularly when you're trying to potentially use the network to unlock more land for development as well. So, you know, the competing priorities there are dwarfed by the fact that you just don't have any money in the grand scheme of things. And there are potentially novel ways that we can sort of boost that through private investment, but fundamentally, you know, there isn't a huge amount of money at play.
Well, all right. Wait, sorry, Antonia, did you want to?
Well, just briefly, I'd just raise the profile of the fact that decarbonising TfL or getting people from A to B isn't a binary choice. Lots of forms that sort of promoting sustainable travel in the capital will include active travel and will indeed be routes from A to B. So I'd suggest there is a Venn diagram there. And also just to make the committee aware that obviously one massive risk to project costs to TfL is volatility around energy prices. That's only set to increase, and I have to admit that I don't have the kind of mapped projected costs in that space, but we do know over the last 3 years that's increased project cost by up to 10%. So just there is a big point around cost of inaction here as well.
So if we then reflect on, I appreciate the committee, I think we're back to where we were before, no one wants to say it, but if we talk about money that has been spent and has been allocated to be spent. So if we're looking at net zero projects spent by TfL, we're looking at around £1.3 billion that has already been spent or is to be spent that they've allocated funding for. So therefore, maybe I repeat the question to you, Tony, going back to the point of you're saying £8 billion doesn't exist. Well, the £1.3 billion has and does exist. So therefore, I ask the same question, should that money not have been spent on replacing the stock on the Bakerloo and DLR rather than net zero?
Well, I agree with. Antonia's point is that there is a perfectly respectable political choice with all of this. So nobody, I think, wants the kind of dismal, soot-gulching public transport vehicles we used to have. Okay, I can remember when buses were pretty polluting. They're good things for and of themselves, but they were polluting. So I don't think any of us would disagree getting rid of buses or indeed the generation of electricity from power stations in London that generated soot. None of us thinks that was a good idea. So the only question in this, where do we land when there's a shortage of money between those kind of objectives, which I think we'd all share, and investing more in the existing system or extending it, which, as Antonia says, could also play a role in reducing the amount of carbon that we use and reducing emissions. So I'm not sure, that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure I can fully judge the compare and contrast exercise backwards, because I think some of that money inevitably would have been spent. Making the air cleaner by whatever means over the last 70 years in London's been a massive public sector achievement under governments nationally and locally of all parties. Whether the money could have been used more efficiently retrospectively, perhaps.
Does anyone else want to just before I ask my final question on that point? No? Okay, thank you. To choose a London borough completely at random, in the London Borough of Enfield, there's been TfL funding, £42 million for a cycle lane that nobody uses. £4 million has been allocated for 20 mile per hour zone across the whole borough, and £2 million at least on LTNs. How would you change the discussions in LIP funding between TfL, the Mayor, and London boroughs if you were to restructure the system?
I can speak to that a bit. I think, at least from a local authority point of view, we would call for increased coordination on the LIP funding in particular. I think we would want to see boroughs involved, sooner in the process around selecting projects and making sure that they're good projects. I think that's something that we've consistently called for. So I think, ensuring that local voice in those LIP conversations, which we know is reflected, but I think we'd want to do that more, is something we definitely would call for.
But then, if I may just final question on this point, how would you then deal with the discrepancy in approach by, let's say, a London borough and the Mayor of London and TfL? So, for example, Mayor Rahman in Tower Hamlets, has completely different views with regard to LTNs as the Mayor of London and the Deputy Mayor do. How do you reconcile, LIP funding and that relationship as to make sure that his residents are still getting the money in LIP funding that they deserve, but then also, he's not held to ransom over particular projects in his approach and moving forward? How would you reconcile that relationship?
Well, you can't. The truth is, in politics, Politicians, as you know, have very different views on things. Some London boroughs want one thing, others the other. They each respect each other in the way they spend money and deliver public policy outcomes, and that's the joy of having 33 separate authorities, 32 boroughs in London. And that inevitably means there'll be a difference between City Hall and town halls, borough halls, local city halls, in the way policy works. And, you know, that's the joy of politics, it seems to me. Oh, by the way, Cruise Hill is going to lead lots of, like, when it's a new town.
Tony, you were doing so well. It's about to kick off. Thank you, Chair.
Just on that, so on that question, is there a case, particularly for you, Luke, is there a case just for saying that LIP funding should just be delegated to boroughs and let them spend it how they want? Is that, I don't know if that's a position that London Councils has, because that would be obviously the other way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that's our official position. I think obviously, obviously the more, more devolution to boroughs and more control over local funding is something that London Councils would definitely support. I think we do recognize that, there's regional priorities as well, and things need to be negotiated. So it's not necessarily one size fits all, but that's definitely, more local control is always something that we're going to support as boroughs. Yeah.
I had assumed that was your position, actually. Actually, Assembly Member Georgie, you had question 17.
Right. So, Antonia, what should, and I appreciate, by the way, in the original exchange with Assembly Member Garrett, a lot of this has been covered by other panel members, but what should TfL be doing to increase passenger numbers on its networks?
I mean, it's a big question. I would point to the fact that at the moment the only truly accessible form of transport in the capital is the black cab, and so making all stations fully accessible would inevitably be a boost. Obviously, of course, prices of fares massively, impacts ridership levels. So sort of mapping out different options with regards to kind of incentives for particular demographics, perhaps that are underutilising the network, would be a good idea. So perhaps it's it's something for the under 25s or whatever it might be. I think I'll probably leave it there. I mean, I will flag the first point that was made on this panel around the fact that kind of post-pandemic ridership is down permanently, and we do know that. So I would suggest, as I said earlier, that TfL looks at reducing the proportion of its revenue from ridership levels. From our estimations, working from home on average is coming out for the sort of stereotypical London worker at around 2 days a week. So it's unlikely that we're going to see, because we now are, quite a few years post-pandemic, going to see a big bounce there. So sort of diversification of income should remain a priority.
Okay, thank you. And with regard to accessibility, obviously there is a discrepancy. So you mentioned the black cab, which I know all panel members love, because it's iconic to London. But, there is a discrepancy in inner and outer London with regard to, in outer London, we don't really have too many black cabs, although it seems that's where most cabbies seem to live. But most of them operate in inner London because that's where the money is. So, therefore, in terms of going with your approach, if you were to make stations more accessible, and I know there is a programme, it's been ongoing across from Ken to Boris to the current Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, would you say there should be a priority from inner London moving outwards?
Yes, and I would also raise the fact that for a long time Central London has advocated for an outer London transport strategy specifically. We know that the makeup of sort of journey use and car use and all the different kind of components of what one looks at when developing a transport strategy is markedly different in outer London from inner, and indeed some of the evidence is suggesting that post-pandemic that divergence has grown. So again, I think an outer London transport strategy is a good idea. In terms of whether the priority should be working from inner London outwards, I would say that essentially data needs to be looked at and kind of where the most use and need is should be prioritised. I would suspect that would be largely in inner London, but there may be pockets of outer London where that's the case too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
If I may, I'm always interested in areas in politics where there's something that's really obvious and everybody agrees that it's really obvious and it never happens. There must be something else going on there. So I don't know, Antonia, whether you have a theory about why there hasn't been an outer London transport strategy, because it's quite obvious that it would be beneficial. I don't know whether you have any theory about why it hasn't happened.
I don't have any crystal ball into the outer London transport strategy absence, sorry.
Fair enough. Okay. In that case, we move on to Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, hello. These are the final set of questions are from me. I'll come to you first, Tony. How concerned should we be that TfL has cut almost 300 million from its capital renewals budget?
Okay. I mean, the failure to invest in capital is a besetting problem of the British state, not unique to TfL, not unique to any one party. Some governments at the national level do a bit better than others, but it's a besetting problem which almost certainly explains UK's productivity problem, amongst other things. But in the particular case of London, big cities, we all know it's a cliche, we all know this, depend absolutely on infrastructure, physical infrastructure, railway infrastructure, buses, water infrastructure, whole project separate entirely. And of course, if we allow these things to fall behind in terms of investment and maintenance, we end up with problems. And that happened for the whole period from 1947, the nationalisation in 1947, right the way through till, frankly, the late 90s. There was certainly the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. And now the system looks better than it did in the 80s, but there's always a risk it can be tipped back again by underinvestment and under-maintenance. So there's two things, really. One is maintaining the existing assets in good order, and the other is reinvesting for the future. I note, read the press, that Paris is buying 400 metro trains. I assume those are paid for by the state. When, the Piccadilly line and the DLR added together, I guess, are about 140 trains. It's a very big difference in two rather similar cities. So I think the risk of underinvestment in transport, not just TfL transport, but the soon-to-be government-owned question there, how's that going to be run in London? Commuter rail system is a profound and long-term one, which occasionally the UK gets right, but most of the time it gets wrong.
Right. So we're going to load up longer-term problems or risk doing so. So to summarise, we risk having longer-term problems by underinvesting now.
Well, I mean, it's a bit, in a sense, not to stop Michael, it's a bit worse than that, because the sense now that a lot of investment in London's transport in the last 20 to 25 years, and there has been a significant amount, means that somehow London's done and now all the investment needs to be in the Midlands and the North. Nothing wrong with investing in the Midlands and the North, but the idea there's a fixed total of capital investment, because the fixed total of public expenditure over time, can't pretend there isn't. But, this is investing for the future, and all governments, including this one, wrestle with the idea of trying to get revenue spending down at the national level in order that they get headway to invest for the future. And they never get there. And so the challenge for transport in London, but you can see it in the water sector in London, in the private sector as well, that didn't end well, is that we so underinvest that 20 years out from now, you can see the problems, and then there has to be a huge catch-up just to stay where we are.
Yep. Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if I can row in behind Tony, definitely we should be concerned. Potentially we should be very concerned, but quite house concerned. It depends on having more information than we have at the moment, and for me that's a pointer to something that the committee might usefully consider in terms of its engagement with TfL through the budget determination process. Just to take a step back, so as you indicated quite correctly, in its final budget, TfL allocated £300 million less this year for renewals than it was originally given for that purpose. It was going to be 1.1 million, which would have put it above the level of steady-state annual investment that they say is required to maintain the network at some sort of acceptable level. It's turned out to be less than 800. So it's less than what they identify as steady-state. It's not going to make up the backlog. The backlog, I think I read somewhere on the TfL network and renewals, is 5 billion. You don't expect to make that all over 1 year, but it's significant. Why should we be concerned? Well, one, it's not in line with what TfL say they need to be investing to achieve steady state. The steady state figure of £1 billion is predicated on various assumptions that are built into the capital strategy, which was published a year ago by TfL. It's a 20-year strategy. It envisages that sort of order of spend on renewables for the first 5 years of the strategy. For the remaining 15 years, there's a significant ramping up of the assumed level of investment in capital renewals. Goodness knows where that level is going to come from. And the more that you cut your cloth now, the more you're pushing to the right a need to increase that level. And by the way, the average for that 15 years is something of the order of 2.8 billion per annum for 15 years. So that's another reason to be particularly concerned. Here's the point about how concerned should we be. I didn't read anywhere in that capital strategy a year ago, and I haven't since found out, despite all my questions to TfL, what is the real-term consequence in terms of performance on the network of their assumptions in the capital strategy and the fact that they're not even going to meet their assumptions in the capital strategy for the first 5 years. What's the deterioration in service that effectively we through TfL are buying because they've decided to spend less than £800 million in renewals this year and potentially in future years, because there's no operating surplus worth talking about that's projected for this year that could fund an increase in renewals next year. And my invitation to the committee is, please ask the same question to TfL. What's the real-life service consequence of their assumptions around renewals expenditure? When we know that, then we can decide how nervous should we be, how worried should we be, and what should be the consequence of doing something about it. Final point, the 300 million odd that they aren't spending, that they were allocated to spend on renewals expenditure, is pretty much the consequence of having 90 million less in farebox revenue and 185 million pounds more in costs than they expected. So effectively, renewals expenditure has been the swing item as a consequence of not managing their risks on income and on costs. Must do better.
That's really helpful, thank you. And we will be asking that question to TfL. This is the final question, and it's for all of you, really. So Antonia brought up earlier, and quite rightly, that our network is so reliant on fares in London, as we all know. What balance should the Mayor make in terms of affordable fares versus raising the revenue from fares to be able to invest in the network and improve the network as well? What's the right balance there? Because I think people do complain to us as Assembly members all the time, the cost of travel. Equally, I think many Londoners would think that there's a lot of good value in public transport travel as well, particularly things like the Hopper fare. Where is that balance struck, and what more could the Mayor be doing to get that balance right?
I can take that first. I mean, obviously, the balance in practice needs to be sort of modelled out and sort of cost-benefit analysis for different demographic groups considered. But a couple of things that I would say. Obviously, we know that it is the poorest Londoners that pay the most for travel in the capital. So we know that on average, the average Londoner spends around 11% of their income on transport, and that rises to 17–18% for the lowest decile. So prioritisation of those at the bottom needs to remain an absolute priority. We're massively supportive of the Hopper fare concept for bus travel, and we know that it's relatively low cost but really high impact on those poorest households in the capital. So that's absolutely a priority to kind of ensure maintenance of. Conversely, you know, talking about where that balance should exactly sit, whilst fare freezes do a lot for kind of pounds in people's pockets, they are universally felt and they are costly. So we know that a one-year fare freeze costs around £70 million in lost revenue. So we would suggest that perhaps there's a more progressive application of fare freezes. And then the other couple of things we would suggest would be to protect free and concessionary travel. So kind of obviously the Freedom Pass, 60 plus, the ZIP, different mechanisms there. And yeah, as I've mentioned, obviously perhaps phase out the universal fare freezes in favour of a targeted low income discount of some description.
Jonathan.
I think, you know, this is the kind of inherent problem with the broader funding of TfL, is that, as we've discussed, it's overly reliant on the fare box, and therefore, as Tony mentioned at the start, you know, that has a huge impact. So it is tempting to kind of slash fares, but that means you're slashing the investment in both the operational costs and that's not even talking about the capital expenditure that we've kind of highlighted as well. So I don't think there's an easy answer in terms of the existing balance, other than to think about how you diversify kind of the sources of revenue beyond that. So the creation of Places for London, you know, is a good thing, and hopefully will start to pay a dividend back into TfL coffers. You know, the ability to reduce costs, TfL is probably sort of, you know, looking at that, and that would help. Then you start to get into kind of more politically contentious and challenging areas, like things such as, you know, devolving taxation revenues and the work that Tony's done with the London Finance Commission around, you know, potentially further fiscal powers coming to London, and then choosing to invest some of the increases, if taxation was made, or if choices were made about that, into TfL. So I think the kind of exact focus on the existing fares is challenging without looking actually at the broader picture. But the last thing I would say on specifically on fares is that I do think there are some oddities in the system. And, you know, I think we're certainly keen to have a look at, certainly at the moment, you know, if you are over a certain age, yet you are a higher rate taxpayer, you can get free travel into the centre of London. Is that the right, you know, way? So I think there's that's not going to save you a huge amount of money, by the way, but there is some potentially, you know, issues with existing on some specific fares.
I mean, at risk of saying something that I've sort of said in a different context already, the TfL operates in a very British public transport environment. So what we have in London is one of the most extensive, if not the most extensive, public transports systems in the world, certainly one of the biggest, but one which Antonio made this point at the beginning, is far, far more funded by fares than most of its equivalents, certainly in Europe and indeed in New York. And, you know, anecdote but important, you know, I was going to go to Manchester for an event recently, looked up the early morning fare midweek to go to Manchester, and then worked out I could go to Rome and back twice, I think it was, for the cost of this particular fare. Now, that's not the National Railway. Well, it is, it's using sort of particular form of pricing, but it's because it, like London's transport system, fits in a broader approach in the UK, which is not unique to public transport, where the state seeks to maximise user charges. And that's just it's a British way of doing things. It could be done differently. But until and unless, as Jonathan says, some other way of filling the gap. And, you know, the 2 billion retained business rates is filling a gap. That's a big piece of gap filling from where the fares would have been otherwise. So I think we have to be very careful about giving away the fare box in any circumstances, because, you know, every 100 million given away is effectively, I make it up, 1 to 2 billions worth of borrowing you could do to improve the system.
So apart from the motherhood and apple pie statement, which is there's a balance to be struck between affordability and quality of service and investing in quality of service. Just a slightly different angle on this. We talked earlier about predominantly downside risks in the forthcoming budget. I see some potential upside risks, and I think, again, it would be, good work by the committee to explore just where is TfL at with regard to these, because they might give headroom for a combination of increased investment plus doing something on fares. What are the upside opportunities? So we may be seeing, if the consultation, which I think it has concluded on an increase in the congestion charge, leads to that being implemented. It's supposed to be implemented from January next year. The estimates I've seen is that net revenue hit to net additional revenue to TfL of 40 million a year. So that's somewhere going to be in the system, presumably. TfL has a target to reduce the level of fare evasion, which of course has been a very topical subject recently. If they achieve their target, my maths says that that target is a 2030 target. By that point in time, annually, they'll be increasing revenue of the order of 80 to 110 million. Could be even more, because actually the target will apply to a higher revenue base if they continue to grow revenue annually. There is something slightly troubling in this year's numbers around income from ULEZ enforcement being higher than it should be, than anticipated, because I think the whole point was ultimately this would be declining to zero at some point. It's gone in the opposite direction, which doesn't feel right. The small upside is there's more money in the pocket. What's the story about that? You start to put these things together with other things which are ongoing, such as efficiency savings, which may have already been spent, of course, in the minds of TfL. But it does seem to me that there are potential opportunities that provide some relief and therefore potentially some opportunity to do something on fares as well as something on investment. And I think the committee should get under the skin of that with TfL.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Just quickly, Michael, about the change in tone on TfL on their renewals and the cutting their budget. A year ago, they had a sort of internal report that said that they're, on the London Underground, beginning to see service impacts resulting from degrading asset base, which is exactly the risk we've just been talking about, and yet they've now cut about a quarter off that budget. In your conversations with them, have you got any sense of why they've changed their mind on that?
So, Chair, I spotted the same reference to operational difficulties, I think was the phrase used, impacting on the ability to grow revenue. I find it difficult to understand exactly what the level of understanding is within TfL about the consequences of a given level of spend on renewals, translating into service performance, translating then into fare box revenue. Just one cameo or vignette for what it's worth. Bakerloo Line trains, the need to replace the oldest fleet in the UK, a topic that's come before this committee and the Transport Committee of the Assembly previously. Precisely for that reason, precisely because there's a delay in the potential replacement, we've done a little bit of digging to find out what's the risk that the Bakerloo Line becomes the next version of what happened a year ago with the Central Line, and that we see suddenly services falling off a cliff edge, service performance falling off a cliff edge. In a nutshell, TfL have assured us that they're pretty confident in the meantime, until such time as the new fleet comes along, they will be able to do enough by way of, the depots, making sure that the fleet is still fit for purpose, that service will not degrade, which we found interesting because recently Bakerloo Line performance had fallen. The reply to that was it was actually an issue about staff availability, not about kit. We take at face value their assurance. We will, of course, be holding them to account that their confidence that they can keep the kit going until such time as the trains arrive, which is probably not going to be before the end of this decade, that confidence is well placed. I really hope it is. It's a small reminder, though, that the issues around service performance is complex, and the fact that staff availability is just as important as that the standard of the kit was a timely reminder. By the way, they reassure us that the staff availability challenge is being addressed.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely a worry. I'm glad you're probing into it. Quick final question from Assemblymember Roberts and a quick final answer.
It's a quick, whether it's a quick answer, I don't know. It's just more to do with the Freedom Pass, which was just touched on earlier, and it's the viability of the scheme, given that we're seeing London councils having their funding cut hugely through fair funding, and the fact that we're already paying 320 million, I think, to fund the scheme at the moment. Is this a viable scheme going forward? And if not, what should we do to try to address the problem? Anybody? I don't know.
Well, Jonathan hinted at this delicately, I thought. I mean, I don't think you'd start from here with a concessionary fare scheme. If you remember the 60 to 65 add-on, which county was City Hall, bad mistake, City Hall funds, that was part of an electoral competition 15 or more years ago now, wasn't it? And Antonia touched on this. I think if there were no concessionary fare schemes today in London, would this be the one in the precise way it works that we came up with? I doubt it. Difficulty is, I don't need to say to a room full of politicians, removing concessions, removing any benefits from anybody is incredibly politically difficult. But I take your point about the particular position of the London boroughs who fund the bulk of the scheme, the 65 plus scheme, given that they are going to lose, on current figures, substantially from the fair funding review. Whether they then choose to take that on will, of course, be a very interesting piece of politics.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gareth is not a panellist. So I'd like that brings an end to our. There was an off-mic question to Gareth over here, which I'm sure we can discuss afterwards. So that brings to an end our questions on our third and final panel this morning. I'd like to thank all of our panellists, current and previously, for your answers to our questions this morning. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion, and delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from the meeting? And quick bit of housekeeping. Can we note the Mayor's decision lists for the periods 28th of June to the 13th of August 2025, and hold your horses, and the 14th of August to the 28th of August 2025, and decide whether to highlight any issues for detailed consideration? Agreed. Good. Can we note the committee's work programme and meeting dates? And the next meeting of the committee will be held on the 18th of November 2025 at 10 a.m. in the chamber here at City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.